The fluorescent lights of Stapleton International Airport flickered to life at 4:47 a.m. on November 15, 1983, illuminating empty corridors that would soon pulse with the chaos of a typical Tuesday morning. Outside, Denver slept under a blanket of early winter darkness, unaware that within hours, a simple act of human carelessness would bring the world closer to nuclear annihilation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Colonel James Mitchell of the United States Air Force stood in the security line, his leather briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. At 52 years old, Mitchell had served his country for 3 decades, rising through the ranks with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and unwavering dedication to protocol. He had flown missions over Vietnam, trained pilots at Nellis Air Force Base, and for the past 18 months had been assigned to one of the most sensitive positions in the American military apparatus. He was a courier for SJOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, America's blueprint for nuclear war. The briefcase Mitchell carried that morning was unremarkable in appearance. A standard-issue brown leather attaché case that could have belonged to any businessman or government employee. But its contents were anything but ordinary. Inside, secured by a combination lock and bound in red classified folders, were documents that detailed targeting coordinates for Soviet missile installations, updated intelligence on Warsaw Pact military movements, and revised response protocols for various nuclear strike scenarios. In the wrong hands, this information could compromise American nuclear strategy, expose intelligence sources, and potentially shift the balance of power in the Cold War's most dangerous game of chess. Mitchell had made this journey 17 times before. The routine was always the same. Receive the briefcase at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, maintain constant physical contact with it during transport, deliver it to Strategic Air Command Headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and return with updated materials. He had never experienced so much as a hiccup in the process. His record was impeccable, his vigilance constant. But on this particular morning, Colonel Mitchell was not himself. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours, having spent the previous day dealing with a family emergency. His youngest daughter, Sarah, had been in a car accident. Nothing serious, but enough to send him rushing to the hospital in the middle of preparing for his scheduled courier run. The Air Force had offered to delay the mission, but Mitchell, ever the professional, had insisted he could handle it. He would manage his personal crisis and complete his duty. It was what he had always done. As he moved through security, Mitchell placed the briefcase on the X-ray conveyor belt, a procedure he had performed countless times. The security officer, a middle-aged man named Frank Delgado who had worked at Stapleton for 12 years, nodded at Mitchell with the familiarity of routine. Military personnel in uniform were a common sight at Denver's airport, given its proximity to multiple Air Force installations. Delgado watched the briefcase slide through the machine, its contents obscured by the standard security measures that prevented classified materials from being readable on X-ray screens. Mitchell walked through the metal detector without incident and stood on the other side, waiting for his briefcase to emerge. But in that moment his mind wandered. He thought of Sarah lying in her hospital bed, the bruises on her face, the fear in her eyes. He thought of his wife, Margaret, who had looked at him with disappointment when he announced he still had to make his flight. The weight of competing responsibilities pressed down on him like a physical force. The conveyor belt continued its mechanical rhythm. Bags and briefcases emerged from the X-ray machine in steady succession. Mitchell reached out automatically, his hand closing around a brown leather briefcase. He checked his watch. 6 minutes until boarding. He turned and walked toward Gate B-17, his mind already moving ahead to the flight, the delivery, the return home. Behind him, still sitting on the conveyor belt, was another brown leather briefcase, nearly identical to the one Mitchell had just picked up, unremarkable, ordinary, and containing the nuclear secrets of the United States of America. Frank Delgado watched the unclaimed briefcase complete its journey through the X-ray machine. He waited for someone to claim it, but the flow of passengers continued past it. After 2 complete rotations on the belt, he called out, "Excuse me, someone forgot their briefcase." His voice was swallowed by the ambient noise of the terminal, the announcements, the conversations, the underlying hum of modern air travel. What neither Delgado nor Mitchell knew in that moment was that the briefcase Mitchell had grabbed belonged to Robert Thornton, a pharmaceutical sales representative from Boulder who was heading to a conference in Kansas City. And Thornton's briefcase, now in Mitchell's possession, contained nothing more sensitive than sales reports, product brochures, and a paperback novel Thornton had been reading on his previous flight. The real escalated briefcase sat unclaimed, a ticking time bomb of information that, in the geopolitical climate of 1983, could reshape the global order. November of 1983 was perhaps the most dangerous month of the entire Cold War. NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise was underway, a massive military drill that Soviet intelligence feared might be a cover for an actual first strike. Tensions were at a fever pitch following the Soviet downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. President Reagan had recently announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the Soviets viewed as a destabilizing shift in the nuclear balance. KGB stations around the world were on high alert for any sign of American aggression. And now, sitting on a conveyor belt in Denver, Colorado, was a briefcase that could confirm the Soviet Union's worst fears or provide them with the intelligence windfall of the century. The morning shift was changing at Stapleton's Lost and Found office. Martha Henshaw, a grandmother of 4 who had worked for the airport for 6 years, was preparing to take over from the night shift supervisor. She believed in the power of routine, of systems and order. Her domain, a small office near Terminal A, was meticulously organized. Every lost item was tagged, logged, and stored according to a system she had personally developed. Umbrellas in one section, clothing in another, electronics carefully cataloged and secured. At 5:23 a.m., Frank Delgado appeared at her door, the brown leather briefcase in his hand. "Got an abandoned bag from security," he said, filling out the standard form. "Came through X-ray, nobody claimed it. Went through twice on the belt." Martha took the briefcase, noting its weight, its quality construction, the small scuff mark on one corner. "Any identification tags?" she asked. "Nothing visible," Delgado replied. "Probably his business cards or something inside." "I'll log it and try to locate the owner," Martha said, already reaching for her tag system. "If it's got an address or phone number inside, we can call them." Delgado nodded and returned to his post, his mind already moving to the next task, the next passenger, the next bag moving through his X-ray machine. Martha Henshaw placed the briefcase on her desk and reached for the combination lock. It was standard procedure to inventory lost items, to search for owner information. But this lock was different from the usual briefcase locks. It was a military-grade combination system, far more sophisticated than anything she typically encountered. She tried a few random combinations without success, then set it aside. She would try to open it later, after the morning rush. As dawn broke over Denver, 3 distinct threads of the coming crisis began to unspool, each moving forward with the inexorable momentum of a Greek tragedy, each carrying its own seeds of catastrophe, each completely unaware of the other's existence. Colonel James Mitchell settled into Seat 12A aboard United Airlines Flight 447, a Boeing 737 bound for Omaha with a scheduled arrival time of 8:35 a.m. The briefcase that he believed contained America's nuclear secrets sat on his lap during takeoff, as protocol required. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, he would handcuff it to his wrist for the remainder of the journey. This was standard operating procedure for SJP couriers, a practice designed to ensure that classified materials remained in authorized possession at all times. As the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, Mitchell allowed himself a moment of relief. Despite his exhaustion, despite the emotional toll of the previous 24 hours, he had maintained his professional standards. The briefcase was secure. The mission was proceeding according to plan. In less than 3 hours, he would hand these materials over to Strategic Air Command, complete his debrief, and return to Colorado Springs to be with his family. The flight attendant passed through the cabin, offering coffee and orange juice. Mitchell accepted a cup of black coffee grateful for the caffeine. As he took his first sip, his watch alarm beeped, a reminder he had set to perform a routine security check. This was another habit from 3 decades of military service. Verify, verify, verify. Never assume. Always confirm. Mitchell placed his coffee in the seat back holder and reached for the briefcase. He spun the combination lock with practiced ease, his fingers moving through the sequence he had memorized and performed countless times. 17-42-09. The lock didn't open. A flutter of concern moved through his chest. He tried again, more carefully this time, ensuring each number aligned precisely with the indicator mark. 17-42-09. The lock remained stubbornly closed. Mitchell felt the first cold finger of dread touch his spine. He tried the combination a third time, his movements now deliberate and slow, double-checking each rotation. Nothing. The lock would not yield. Perhaps I'm more tired than I thought, he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath to calm his rising anxiety. Fatigue could affect memory, could cause simple mistakes. He closed his eyes and visualized the combination, the muscle memory of his fingers performing the familiar sequence. Then he tried again. Still nothing. It was in this moment, with his 4th failed attempt, that Colonel James Mitchell truly looked at the briefcase for the first time since leaving the security checkpoint. His eyes, now focused with the intensity of growing panic, began to notice details. The scuff mark on the corner was in the wrong position. The leather, upon closer inspection, was a slightly different shade of brown. The handle, which should have shown were patterns from 17 previous trips, looked nearly new. With trembling hands, Mitchell turned the briefcase over. On the bottom, stamped in small gold letters, were the initials RT. The coffee cup slipped from the seat back holder and spilled on the cabin floor, but Mitchell didn't notice. His mind was racing through the implications of what he had just discovered, each realization worse than the last. This was not his briefcase, which meant his briefcase, the briefcase containing some of the most sensitive military intelligence in the United States arsenal, was somewhere else, somewhere he had left it, somewhere it was now in the possession of persons unknown. The world seemed to tilt around him. In his entire military career, spanning 3 wars and countless classified operations, Mitchell had never committed a security breach. His record was spotless. And now, in a single moment of distraction, he had potentially committed the greatest security failure of the Cold War. His training kicked in, overriding the panic. There was a protocol for this, a chain of command to notify, procedures to follow. Mitchell pressed the flight attendant call button with more force than necessary. "I need to speak with the pilot immediately," he said when she arrived, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "It's a matter of national security." The flight attendant, a young woman named Jessica Randolph who had been flying for less than a year, saw the rank insignia on Mitchell's uniform and the deadly seriousness in his eyes. Without question, she moved quickly to the cockpit. Captain Thomas Burke, a Vietnam veteran himself with 23 years of commercial flying experience, listened to Mitchell's terse explanation and made an immediate decision. He radioed Denver Air Traffic Control. "Denver Center, United 447, we have a national security emergency on board. Requesting immediate return to Stapleton." In the air traffic control tower, Controller David Chun processed this information with professional calm, but his heart rate elevated. In 12 years of managing airspace, he had never heard such a request. "United 447, say again? Confirm national security emergency." "Affirmative, Denver. We need priority handling back to Stapleton. Military courier has lost classified materials at your facility." Chin supervisor, Sandra Mills, was already picking up a red phone, the direct line to NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, located just 90 miles south in Cheyenne Mountain. The Cold War had prepared protocols for every contingency and lost classified materials, especially those related to nuclear operations, triggered an immediate alert condition. United Flight 447 began its banking turn back toward Denver. In the cabin, Mitchell sat with his head in his hands, the wrong briefcase sitting mockingly on his lap. He was calculating the damage, running through worst-case scenarios. If the briefcase had been picked up by a foreign agent, by a Soviet intelligence officer, the consequences were almost unthinkable. Current targeting data, response protocols, intelligence sources and methods. It was a complete blueprint of American nuclear strategy. But there was something even more terrifying than the briefcase falling into Soviet hands. In the current climate of 1983, with tensions already at a breaking point, with Soviet leadership genuinely fearing an American first strike, the discovery of detailed U.S. nuclear war plans could trigger exactly the crisis those plans were designed to deter. Soviet generals, seeing evidence of American strike preparations, might conclude that their window for preemptive action was closing. The briefcase wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was a potential catalyst for World War III. At Peterson Air Force Base, the secure phone in General Robert Hastings' office began to ring. Hastings, commander of Air Force Base Command and Mitchell's direct superior, picked up on the first ring. What he heard in the next 90 seconds caused him to immediately initiate a DEFCON alert upgrade for all units under his command. Within minutes, encrypted messages were flashing to Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, to the National Security Council in Washington, to the Pentagon, and to NORAD. The phrases "broken arrow" and "nuclear protocols compromised" appeared in classified communications, triggering emergency response procedures that had been practiced but never executed under actual crisis conditions. At the lost and found office in Stapleton Airport, Martha Henshaw had still not managed to open the stubborn briefcase lock. She had other items to process, other lost belongings to catalog. The briefcase sat on her shelf, tagged and logged, waiting. In her meticulous handwriting, the log entry read, "Brown leather briefcase, combination lock, no external ID, found at Security Checkpoint B, 5:23 a.m., November 15th, 1983. She had no idea that outside her small office, the entire machinery of American national security was beginning to mobilize. No idea that military police were being dispatched to the airport. No idea that intelligence agencies were being briefed. No idea that in Moscow, NSA intercepts were already picking up increased Soviet military communications, suggesting that their intelligence services might have detected the unusual American military activity and were responding with heightened alert status of their own. The briefcase sat on the shelf, silent and innocuous, while around it, two superpowers began the terrible dance of escalation that could end in nuclear fire. In the skies above Denver, United Flight 447 descended rapidly, given priority clearance through all air traffic. Mitchell sat in his seat, watching the city grow larger through the window, and prayed that he would not be remembered as the man who started World War III through an act of simple, human carelessness. The aircraft touched down at 6:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 23 minutes after the briefcase had been abandoned at the security checkpoint. In crisis management terms, this was an eternity. The briefcase could have changed hands multiple times. It could be anywhere in the airport, anywhere in Denver, anywhere in the world if someone had immediately left on an outbound flight. As the aircraft taxied toward a remote hardstand away from the main terminal, Mitchell could see what awaited him. Military vehicles, their lights flashing, Air Force security personnel in full combat gear, several unmarked black sedans that he recognized as belonging to intelligence services. And in the center of it all, a figure in a general's uniform that Mitchell recognized with a sinking feeling as Robert Hastings himself. This was no longer just a lost briefcase. This was a national crisis, unfolding in real time, with consequences that no one could yet fully predict. And at its center was a middle-aged Air Force colonel who had simply picked up the wrong bag. The Situation Room at the White House had seen its share of crises since its establishment in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Yom Kippur War, the fall of Saigon, each had filled this underground nerve center with a controlled chaos of high-stakes decision-making. But on the morning of November 15th, 1983, the assembled officials faced a crisis unique in its potential for catastrophic misunderstanding. President Ronald Reagan was in the Oval Office when National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane rushed in with the initial report at 7:15 a.m. Eastern Time. The president, who had been reviewing his daily intelligence briefing, looked up to see an expression on McFarland's face that he had never witnessed before. Not quite panic, but something close to it. "Mr. President, we have a broken arrow situation at Denver's Stapleton Airport," McFarland said without preamble. In nuclear weapons terminology, broken arrow designated an accident involving nuclear weapons themselves. But in this context, it had been adapted to mean a critical breach in nuclear security protocols. Reagan, a man whose affable public persona concealed a sharp understanding of geopolitical stakes, immediately grasped the seriousness. "How bad is it, Bud?" "SIOP materials, sir. Current targeting packages, response protocols, updated intelligence assessments. Everything an adversary would need to understand our nuclear posture and potentially compromise our deterrent capability." The courier lost physical control of the briefcase at approximately 5 a.m. Mountain Time. We're now at 2 hours and 15 minutes since the breach. The president's jaw tightened. He had been in office for just over 2 years, and the nuclear responsibility weighed on him constantly. He had recently watched a classified screening of The Day After, a television movie about nuclear war, and had written in his diary that it had left him greatly depressed. Now, that fictional nightmare had the potential to become reality through an act of simple human error. "What's our current assessment of Soviet knowledge?" Reagan asked, already thinking several moves ahead. "NSA is reporting increased chatter on Soviet military channels. Nothing specific yet, but their intelligence services are clearly aware that something has triggered unusual U.S. military activity. Given the Able Archer exercise already underway, they're in a heightened state of alert." This was the nightmare scenario that kept Cold War planners awake at night. Not a deliberate act of aggression, but a cascade of misunderstandings and miscalculations that could spiral into nuclear war. The Soviets, already paranoid about American intentions, might interpret the sudden surge in U.S. military communications as confirmation of their fears. They might see evidence of war preparations rather than the frantic search for lost documents. "I want a full NSC meeting in 30 minutes, Reagan ordered. "And give me the Soviet ambassador. We may need to use the hotline." The hotline, formerly known as the Direct Communications Link, was the secure teletype connection between Washington and Moscow, established after the Cuban Missile Crisis to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous misunderstanding. But using it would itself send a signal to the Soviets that something major was happening, potentially accelerating the very crisis they were trying to prevent. Back at Stapleton Airport, a perimeter had been established around the lost and found office. Martha Henshaw had been escorted out by stone-faced military police officers who had arrived in force at 7:02 a.m. She stood now in an airport security office, thoroughly confused and increasingly frightened, as an Air Force investigator named Colonel Sarah Drummond questioned her with urgent intensity. "Mrs. Henshaw, I need you to think very carefully," Drummond said, her voice measured but firm. "The brown leather briefcase that was brought to your office at 5:23 a.m. Did you open it? Did you examine its contents?" "I tried to open it," Martha replied, her voice shaking slightly. "But the combination lock wouldn't budge. I was going to try again later, but I got busy with other items and—" "Did anyone else have access to your office between 5:23 and when we arrived?" "No, I'm certain of that. I was alone the entire time. The briefcase has been on my shelf, exactly where I placed it. In a lost and found office, a team of Air Force security specialists and FBI agents were methodically processing the scene. The briefcase had been located exactly where Martha had indicated, still tagged with her careful notation. An explosive ordnance specialist swept it for booby traps, a precaution that might have seemed excessive except for the fact that in the paranoid world of Cold War intelligence, nothing was too far-fetched. At 7:34 a.m. Mountain Time, Major Kevin Ross, a specialist in classified materials recovery, approached the briefcase with a pair of bolt cutters. The decision had been made not to attempt cracking the combination. Too time-consuming, too risky. They needed to confirm the contents immediately. The lock mechanism severed with a sharp metallic crack that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of the office. Ross carefully opened the briefcase, and for a moment, every person in the room held their breath. Inside were the red-bordered folders that marked classified documents. The SIOP materials, apparently untouched and in order. Ross's shoulders sagged with visible relief, but his job was far from over. Each document needed to be accounted for, verified against the courier manifest, checked for signs of tampering or photography. Preliminary assessment. Ross reported into his radio. All materials appear to be present and secure. Beginning detailed inventory now. This news rippled out through the chain of command with electric speed. In Washington, the NSC meeting was just convening when the update arrived. But the relief was tempered by a sobering reality. They didn't yet know whether the documents had been compromised during the 2.5 hours they were unattended. CIA Director William Casey raised the critical question. Do we know if anyone examined these documents? Could they have been photographed and returned to the briefcase? Negative on confirmed compromise came the response from the field team in Denver. But we cannot rule it out. The briefcase was accessible to airport personnel and, potentially, to the general public. We're reviewing all security camera footage, interviewing everyone who had access to that area of the terminal. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger leaned forward in his chair. Gentlemen, we need to consider the possibility that Soviet intelligence deliberately orchestrated this. The switch of briefcases could have been intentional, executed by an agent who then photographed the contents and returned the briefcase to Lost and Found. The room fell silent as this scenario was considered. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of operation the KGB excelled at: elegant, deniable, and devastating in its effectiveness. If that's the case, McFarland said slowly, then the Soviets now have our complete nuclear war plan. They know our targets, our response timelines, our command and control procedures. They could use this information to position their forces to neutralize our deterrent capability. Or, interjected John Poindexter, Deputy National Security Advisor, they could misinterpret the information. These documents include contingency plans for various scenarios, including preemptive strikes. If Soviet intelligence sees those plans out of context, they might conclude we're preparing for an imminent first strike. This was the terrible paradox at the heart of nuclear strategy. The same plans designed to prevent war could, if revealed, actually trigger one. Deterrence depended on credibility, but also on strategic ambiguity. Too much transparency could be as dangerous as too little. President Reagan listened to the spiraling assessments and made a decision. We need to assume worst-case scenario until proven otherwise. That means we operate on the premise that the Soviets have seen these documents. What are our options? General John Vesey Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke up. Mr. President, if our targeting information is compromised, we need to immediately begin shifting our nuclear posture. New targeting packages, altered patrol routes for our bomber fleet, repositioning of mobile ICBMs. It's a massive undertaking, but it's necessary to maintain deterrent capability. And how will the Soviets interpret that massive shift in our nuclear forces? Reagan asked pointedly. The question hung in the air. The answer was obvious and terrifying. The Soviets would see a sudden, comprehensive change in American nuclear deployment and might conclude that the United States was preparing for war. They might feel compelled to strike first, to use their weapons before losing them in an American preemptive attack. This was the logic of mutual assured destruction taken to its most absurd extreme. A lost briefcase could trigger the very Holocaust that nuclear weapons were supposed to prevent. In Moscow, Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov was receiving his own briefing. Andropov, already in poor health and deeply suspicious of Western intentions, listened as KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov described the unusual American military activity. Our stations report increased communications at multiple U.S. Air Force bases, particularly those associated with nuclear forces, Chebrikov reported. SAC headquarters at Offutt has gone to elevated alert status. NORAD appears to have initiated some kind of emergency protocol. Is this connected to Abel Archer? Andropov asked, his voice raspy with illness and concern. The NATO exercise had already put Soviet forces on high alert. The KGB had distributed a directive to all stations, codenamed Ryan, ordering them to watch for signs of American nuclear attack preparations. Now, those stations were reporting exactly what Ryan had warned them to look for. It could be Comrade's secretary, Cheberkov admitted, or it could be a separate crisis. Our assessment is that something has triggered an emergency response in the American nuclear command structure. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, was more direct. We must consider the possibility that this is final preparation for a first strike. The Americans may be using Abel Archer as cover for actual war preparations. Andropov, who genuinely believed the Americans might be planning to attack, made his own fateful decision. Increase our alert status. I want all strategic forces ready to respond. If the Americans are preparing to strike, they will find us ready. And so the escalation spiral began, each side responding to the other's defensive measures with their own, each interpretation filtered through the distorting lens of suspicion and fear, each step forward making the next step more likely, more necessary, more dangerous. At Stapleton Airport, Colonel Mitchell stood before General Hastings, giving his account of the morning's events for the third time. His career was over. He knew that with certainty. But that personal catastrophe paled beside the larger crisis his error had created. The question before us, Colonel, Hastings said heavily, is not your punishment. The question is whether your mistake will be the spark that ignites World War III. In the 2.5 hours since the briefcase had been abandoned, the world had moved closer to nuclear war than at any point since 1962. And the worst part was that almost nobody outside the highest levels of government knew how close they stood to annihilation. The crisis was escalating, fed by fear, suspicion, and the terrible momentum of Cold War logic. And at its center was a simple brown leather briefcase, now sitting in a secure military facility, its contents being painstakingly analyzed for any sign of compromise. The world held its breath, unknowing, as leaders in Washington and Moscow made decisions that would determine whether humanity saw another dawn. Deep within the KGB headquarters at Lubyanka Square in Moscow, Colonel Dmitry Volkov sat at his desk in the First Chief Directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations. The report from Station Denver had crossed his desk at 3:47 p.m. Moscow time, and he had read it 3 times, each reading adding new layers to his growing concern. Denver was not a primary KGB station. The Soviet intelligence presence in Colorado was minimal, focused mainly on monitoring the numerous military installations in the region: NORAD, Peterson Air Force Base, the Air Force Academy, and various defense contractors. The station consisted of only 4 officers, operating under diplomatic and commercial cover. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in access to human sources and in their advantageous position to observe American military activities in a region dense with strategic assets. The report was brief but alarming. Unusual military activity observed Stapleton Airport 0700 hours local time. Multiple Air Force security teams deployed. Civilian terminal partially locked down. Increased communications traffic from Peterson AFB and NORAD. Possible security incident involving classified materials. Coincides with elevated U.S. strategic force readiness. Recommend urgent assessment. Volkov picked up his secure phone and dialed an internal extension. I need to brief the chairman immediately. It's about the American situation. 20 minutes later, he stood in the wood-paneled office of Viktor Cheberkov, presenting his analysis to the KGB chairman and a hastily assembled group of senior intelligence officers. The pattern is clear, Volkov explained, pointing to a map of the United States with colored pins marking areas of detected activity. Beginning at approximately 1,400 hours Moscow time, we've observed coordinated unusual activity at multiple locations. Strategic Air Command Headquarters at Offutt has increased its communication volume by 47%. NORAD has initiated what appears to be an emergency protocol. And now, this incident in Denver, which our station believes involve classified materials. Your assessment, Colonel? Chebarkov asked. Comrade Chairman, I believe the Americans may have experienced a significant security breach, possibly involving nuclear weapons protocols or targeting information. The response pattern suggests a containment operation of high priority. Another officer, General Pyotr Ivashudin, head of GRU military intelligence, offered an alternative interpretation. Or this could be deception. The Americans create the appearance of a security emergency while actually preparing their forces for attack. It's consistent with what Ryan has warned us to watch for. Unusual activity that appears mundane but masks war preparation. Operation Ryan, an acronym for Raketny Napadny, or nuclear missile attack, was a massive Soviet intelligence effort, initiated by Andropov himself, to detect advance warning of an American nuclear first strike. It had distributed to Soviet intelligence stations worldwide a checklist of indicators to monitor. Unusual movements of government officials, changes in military readiness, increased communications traffic, stockpiling of blood at hospitals, and dozens of other potential signs of war preparation. The problem with Ryan was that it was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about how the United States would actually prepare for and initiate a nuclear war. It assumed rationality, detailed planning, and observable preparation. It couldn't account for accidents, misunderstandings, or the chaotic reality of actual crisis management. We need to bring this to the General Secretary immediately, Chebarkov decided. Prepare a full briefing on American force readiness in this Denver incident. I want every scrap of intelligence we have on current U.S. nuclear posture. While this meeting was taking place, another crucial development was unfolding at the Soviet embassy in Washington. Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, a seasoned diplomat who had served in Washington since 1962 and who understood American politics better than many Americans, received an unusual call from the State Department at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Ambassador Dobrinin, Secretary Shultz would like to see you at the earliest possible opportunity. The matter is of considerable urgency and sensitivity. Dobrinin, who had navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis and countless other Cold War flashpoints, recognized the tone. This was not a routine diplomatic contact. This was crisis management. He arrived at the State Department 40 minutes later and was ushered immediately into the office of Secretary of State George Shultz. What he found there told him everything he needed to know about the gravity of the situation. Not just Shultz, but also Deputy Secretary Kenneth Dam and several senior officials from the NSC and Defense Department. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming on such short notice, Shultz began, dispensing with the usual diplomatic pleasantries. I need to brief you on a situation that has developed this morning, and I need to do so with complete candor because I believe it's essential that your government understand the true nature of what has occurred. For the next 20 minutes, Shultz laid out the details of the lost briefcase, the security breach, and the American response. He was careful to frame it not as a military crisis, but as an unfortunate accident that was being contained. I want to be absolutely clear, Mr. Ambassador, Shultz emphasized. This was not a deliberate act, not part of any operation or plan. It was human error, pure and simple. The classified materials have been recovered. We do not believe they were compromised, but we are taking all necessary precautions, which may result in changes to some of our procedures and possibly to some force deployments. Dobrinin listened carefully, his experienced diplomat's mind analyzing both what was said and what was left unsaid. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your candor, but you must understand how this will be perceived in Moscow. Able Archer is already causing great concern. Now you tell me there has been a security breach involving nuclear materials, followed by increased military activity. My government will see this as confirmation of their worst suspicions, which is precisely why I wanted to brief you directly and immediately, Shultz replied. We are managing an accident, not preparing for war. But we need your government to understand that, because if they misinterpret our response, we could end up in a very dangerous situation. What neither Shultz nor Dobrinin knew was that even as they spoke, Soviet military commanders were receiving orders to increase their alert status. The machinery of escalation was already in motion, driven by institutional momentum and Cold War logic. At a secret Soviet submarine base in the Barents Sea, the crew of K-324, a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, received new orders at 1,615 hours Moscow time. Captain First Rank Alexander Moiseev read the message with growing unease. Proceed to Patrol Station Alpha 7. Increase readiness to DEFCON 3 equivalent. Maintain radio silence unless emergency. Await further orders. Patrol Station Alpha 7 was a position in the Norwegian Sea within range of strategic targets in the United States and Western Europe. K-324 carried 16 SS in 18 ballistic missiles, each with multiple nuclear warheads. The submarine slipped beneath the Arctic waters, one more piece moving on the chessboard of nuclear confrontation. Moiseev had served in the Soviet Navy for 22 years. He had been at sea during the Cuban Missile Crisis as a young officer. He knew the difference between an exercise and genuine preparation for war. These orders felt different. There was an urgency to them, a seriousness that went beyond routine patrol operations. In the submarine's cramped radio room, the communications officer monitored encrypted traffic from naval headquarters. The volume of messages had tripled in the past 2 hours. Something was happening, something big enough to put the entire strategic submarine fleet on enhanced alert. Similar scenes were playing out across the Soviet military apparatus. At bomber bases in the Ukraine and Siberia, crews were being recalled from leave. Mobile ICBM launchers were being dispersed from their garrisons, making them harder to target in a first strike. Air defense networks were going to heighten readiness. Each of these actions was defensive in nature, designed to ensure Soviet forces could survive and respond to an American attack. But to American intelligence, watching through satellites and signals intercepts, each action looked like preparation for war. At the National Security Agency headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, analysts were tracking this surge in Soviet military activity with growing alarm. The signals intelligence reports painted a picture of a Soviet military moving to higher alert status across multiple domains: strategic rocket forces, submarine fleet, long-range aviation, and air defense. This is bigger than their response to Able Archer, observed Dr. Patricia Hammond, senior analyst for Soviet strategic forces. She had been studying Soviet military communications patterns for 8 years and had never seen this level of coordinated activity outside of major exercises. They're not just watching us anymore. They're preparing for something. The NSA assessment landed on the president's desk at 11:47 a.m. Eastern Time, just as the NSC meeting was reconvening to discuss the latest developments from Denver. The news from Stapleton was cautiously positive. The briefcase contents appeared intact and uncompromised. But the Soviet response was turning the accident into something far more dangerous. Mr. President, Defense Secretary Weinberger reported, the Soviets are moving to what we assess as DEFCON 3 equivalent across their strategic forces. This is a significant escalation from their previous alert posture. President Reagan studied the intelligence summaries, his expression grave. The briefings about Soviet paranoia, about Operation Ryan, and the genuine Soviet fear of American attack suddenly took on new and terrible relevance. The Soviets weren't just monitoring the situation, they were preparing to fight. They think we're getting ready to attack them, Reagan said quietly. It wasn't a question. That's our assessment, sir, McFarlane confirmed. Our response to the lost briefcase, combined with Able Archer, has triggered their warning systems. They're seeing exactly what they've been trained to look for: unusual military activity, command posts going to alert status, changes in force readiness. From their perspective, it looks like we're preparing for a first strike. The president turned to Admiral James Watkins, Chief of Naval Operations. What's the status of our submarine fleet? Sir, we have 8 ballistic missile submarines on patrol, all in their assigned stations. We've made no changes to their operations. But the Soviets don't know that. They have to assume we might be repositioning assets as part of whatever they think is happening. Reagan made a decision. We need to de-escalate this before it gets completely out of control. I want to use the hotline to contact General Secretary Andropov directly. We need to convince them this is not what they think it is. The hotline, rarely used outside of its regular test transmissions, represented the ultimate tool for crisis communication. But using it was itself a significant step, one that would confirm to the Soviets that something major was indeed happening. In Moscow, it was approaching midnight when the hotline message arrived at the Kremlin. Yuri Andropov, exhausted and in pain from his kidney disease, was awakened to receive the president's message. He read it slowly, his aides watching his face for reaction. The message was carefully crafted, acknowledging a security incident involving classified materials, but emphasizing that it had been resolved, that no breach of materials had occurred, and that American military activities were solely related to internal security procedures. Reagan stressed that the United States had no hostile intentions and urged both sides to avoid actions that could lead to misunderstanding. Andropov's response would prove crucial. He was genuinely convinced that the United States might attack the Soviet Union. The Reagan administration's rhetoric about the evil empire, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and now Able Archer had created a climate of deep suspicion. The briefcase incident, even explained, fit too neatly into the pattern of American deception that Soviet intelligence had warned about. It could be true, Andropov said to his assembled advisors, or it could be exactly what they would say to lull us before an attack. We cannot afford to let our guard down based on reassuring words when our intelligence shows clear preparation for war. Marshal Ogarkov was more direct. Comrade General Secretary, their explanation is convenient. Too convenient. A lost briefcase? It sounds like a cover story for deliberate intelligence gathering, or worse, for repositioning their forces under the guise of responding to an accident. KGB Chairman Chebarkov offered a more nuanced view. We must consider both possibilities. Either this is genuine and we risk escalating unnecessarily, or this is deception and lowering our guard could be fatal. I recommend we maintain current alert status while continuing to monitor American actions. If this is truly an accident, their elevated military activity should decrease over the next 24 hours. Andropov agreed to this approach. The Soviet military would remain at heightened alert, watching and waiting to see if American actions matched American words. The response that went back over the hotline was polite but non-committal. The Soviet government acknowledged the American message and expressed hope that the situation would be resolved peacefully, but it made no commitment to reduce Soviet force readiness. In the White House Situation Room, the Soviet response was received with frustration and growing concern. The de-escalation attempt had failed to achieve its primary objective. The Soviets remained on high alert, and as long as they stayed there, the risk of accident or miscalculation remained dangerously high. We're in a spiral, observed William Clark, former national security advisor who had been called in for the crisis. They're on alert because they think we're threatening them. We can't stand down our response to the security breach because it would look like we're trying to hide something. They interpret our activity as hostile. We see their alert status as threatening. Round and round it goes, and each rotation brings us closer to the edge. This was the terrible logic of nuclear deterrence under stress. Each side's defensive measures threatened the other. Transparency could compromise security. Opacity fueled suspicion. There was no easy way to step back from the brink without appearing weak or vulnerable. At Stapleton Airport, the investigation into the briefcase incident had expanded into a full-scale counterintelligence operation. FBI agents were interviewing every person who had been in the terminal between 5 o'clock and 7:30 a.m. Security camera footage was being analyzed frame by frame. The possibility that this had been a deliberate Soviet intelligence operation could not be ruled out. Special Agent David Chun of the FBI's Denver field office was leading the investigation. A specialist in counterintelligence with 15 years of experience, Chun approached the case with systematic thoroughness. His team had identified every person who had passed through or worked in the vicinity of the lost and found office during the critical time window. Each was being vetted, their backgrounds checked for any connection to foreign intelligence services. The pharmaceutical salesman whose briefcase had been taken by Colonel Mitchell had been located and thoroughly debriefed. Robert Thornton was exactly who he appeared to be, a 43-year-old sales representative with no intelligence connections, no foreign contacts of significance, and no awareness that he had played even a small role in a potential international crisis. His briefcase, still in Colonel Mitchell's possession, had been examined and found to contain exactly what Thornton had said: sales materials and a paperback novel. But Chen's investigation had uncovered something troubling. Security camera footage showed that during the critical period, a man had approached the lost and found office, spoken briefly with Martha Henshaw, and then left. The cameras didn't provide a clear view of his face, and Martha's recollection was vague. He had asked about a lost wallet. She had checked her logged items, and when she told him they didn't have it, he had thanked her and left. Except we have no record of anyone reporting a lost wallet that morning, Chen noted in his briefing to his superiors. And this man appears on camera entering the terminal at 6:47 a.m. and leaving at 7:15 a.m. He came in after the briefcase was already in the lost and found office and left before we arrived and locked down the area. You think he was checking to see if the briefcase was there? His supervisor asked. I think it's a possibility we can't ignore. If this was a planned operation, someone would have wanted to verify that the switch had worked and the target briefcase had been recovered by airport personnel rather than by the courier. The image of the mystery man was being run through every database available: FBI files, CIA records, NSA intercepts, and through contacts with Allied intelligence services. If he was a Soviet agent, and if this had been a planned operation, identifying him was crucial to understanding the full scope of the breach. As the afternoon wore on in Washington, President Reagan faced a decision that would define his crisis management: how to respond to the Soviet alert status without further escalating tensions, while still protecting American security interests if the briefcase had indeed been compromised. The Joint Chiefs recommended implementing the contingency plans for compromised nuclear targeting data. This would involve a comprehensive shift in American nuclear posture: new targets, new attack routes, altered command and control procedures. It was the militarily sound response. It was also exactly the kind of major change in nuclear force structure that would confirm Soviet suspicions of American hostile intent. If we make those changes now, Reagan observed, we're guaranteeing this crisis continues. The Soviets will see us completely reshuffling our nuclear forces and conclude we're preparing for war. But if the briefcase was compromised and we don't change our posture, General Vesey countered, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable. The Soviets could exploit their knowledge of our plans to position their forces for maximum advantage. It was an impossible choice, and Reagan knew it. Either option carried enormous risks. Standing pat risked military vulnerability. Making changes risked political catastrophe. In the end, he chose a middle path that satisfied no one, but seemed like the least dangerous option. Implement selective changes to the most critical elements of nuclear posture while maintaining overall force structure. It was a compromise, and like all compromises in nuclear strategy, it pleased neither the military commanders who wanted complete security nor the diplomats who wanted complete de-escalation. As darkness fell over Washington and Moscow, the crisis entered its 12th hour. The briefcase was secure, its contents apparently uncompromised, but the damage had been done. Two nuclear superpowers stood facing each other at elevated alert status, each suspicious of the other's intentions, each preparing for the possibility of war. And somewhere in Denver, a man whose face had been captured on grainy security camera footage walked through the city's evening streets, unknown and unidentified, carrying whatever secrets he might have gleaned from a brief moment in an airport's lost and found office. The night ahead would determine whether this crisis could be contained or whether a simple human mistake would indeed light the fuse that led to nuclear holocaust. In a secure facility beneath CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a team of analysts had been working for 6 hours straight, trying to answer one critical question. Had the briefcase been compromised? The conclusion they reached would determine the course of American policy and potentially the fate of millions. Dr. Eleanor Marsh led the team. At 46, she had spent her entire career in intelligence analysis, specializing in Soviet espionage operations. She had studied every major KGB operation of the past 2 decades, understood their methods, their tradecraft, their patterns of behavior. If this had been a Soviet intelligence operation, she would recognize the hallmarks. The evidence spread across the conference table painted an ambiguous picture. The security camera footage from Stapleton showed the mystery man's brief interaction with Martha Henshaw, but the angle was wrong for facial recognition. His clothing was unremarkable. Dark overcoat, business attire, nothing that stood out. His movements were casual, unhurried. He had entered through the main terminal entrance, walked directly to the lost and found, spent approximately 3 minutes there, and departed through the same entrance. If he's a professional, Marsh observed, he's very good. No counter-surveillance moves, no obvious signals to a handler, nothing that screams intelligence operative. But that itself could be a sign of professionalism. Her deputy, Thomas Kowalski, a former FBI counterintelligence specialist, offered a different perspective. He could be exactly what he appeared to be, someone looking for a lost wallet who happened to come and go during our window of interest. Without more evidence, we're seeing patterns that might not be there. The technical analysis of the briefcase and its contents provided no definitive answers. The lock showed no signs of having been picked or forced. The documents inside were in the same order as when Colonel Mitchell had received them. Forensic examination found no fingerprints other than Mitchell's and Martha Henshaw's. No evidence of photography. No chemical traces that might indicate the documents had been removed and replaced. But a sophisticated operation wouldn't leave traces, Marsh countered. The KGB has techniques for photographing documents in situ inside a briefcase without removing them. They have tools that can open combination locks without leaving marks. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. This was the maddening reality of counterintelligence work. You could never prove a negative. You could never be absolutely certain that something hadn't happened. All you could do was assess probabilities, weigh possibilities, and make judgments based on incomplete information. The team's analysis considered multiple scenarios. Scenario 1, pure accident. Colonel Mitchell, exhausted and distracted, simply picked up the wrong briefcase. The mystery man at Lost and Found was unconnected. No compromise occurred. Probability assessment, 40%. Scenario 2, opportunistic compromise. A Soviet agent or sympathizer present in the terminal by coincidence recognized the significance of an unattended briefcase near a security checkpoint and took the opportunity to examine it before it could be secured. Probability assessment, 25%. Scenario 3, planned operation. Soviet intelligence, possibly through surveillance of Colonel Mitchell or other SJP couriers, had identified the courier run and orchestrated the briefcase switch, using an agent to verify the operation's success. Probability assessment, 20%. Scenario 4, false flag. An operation by a third party, another intelligence service, a domestic threat, or even an internal security test, designed to look like either an accident or a Soviet operation. Probability assessment, 10%. Scenario 5, unknown factors not yet considered. Probability assessment, 5%. The problem, Marsh explained in her briefing to CIA Director Casey, is that even our highest probability scenario only hits 40%. We're more likely than not looking at some form of compromise, either opportunistic or planned. But we can't prove it, and we can't quantify the exact nature or extent of the compromise if it occurred. Casey, a veteran of intelligence work who had served in the OSS during World War II, understood the implications. So your recommendation is? Assume compromise until we can prove otherwise. That means implementing contingency plans for exposed nuclear targeting data. It means a full damage assessment. And it means accepting that we may never know for certain what happened in that 2.5-hour window. This assessment landed at the White House at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time, just as another troubling development was emerging from a different intelligence source. NSA had decrypted a burst of Soviet diplomatic communications from the Soviet embassy in Washington to Moscow, sent shortly after Ambassador Dobryn's meeting with Secretary Shultz. The decrypted message was terse but revealing. American explanation of security incident appears coordinated with ongoing Able Archer exercise. Recommend continued vigilance. Cannot rule out deception masking actual war preparation. Current posture assessment remains. Increased probability of American first strike within 72-hour window. 72 hours. President Reagan repeated when he received the report. They think we might attack them within 72 hours. The irony was bitter. The United States had no intention of attacking anyone. The briefcase incident was exactly what American officials had said it was, an unfortunate accident. But the Soviets' paranoia, fed by years of Cold War suspicion and amplified by the current crisis, had transformed an accident into evidence of hostile intent. Mr. President, McFarlane said carefully, we need to consider what happens if the Soviets decide they're running out of time. If they genuinely believe we're preparing to strike, they might conclude their only option is to strike first. This was the nightmare logic of nuclear strategy, the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. If both sides believe the other might strike first, and if both sides believe that striking first provided a decisive advantage, then both sides had an incentive to preempt the other's preemption. It was a race to the bottom, where the most paranoid player determined the outcome for everyone. At Soviet military headquarters in Moscow, a parallel discussion was taking place. The GRU had provided its assessment of American force movements over the past 12 hours, and the picture looked ominous from a Soviet perspective. SAC bomber alert rates have increased by 17%, General Ivashudin reported. Airborne command posts are flying extended missions. We've detected increased communications between command authorities and ICBM launch control centers. Naval forces are maintaining higher operational tempos. All of this is consistent with preparation for nuclear operations. What the Soviet analysts couldn't know, was that these were all defensive measures, responses to the possibility that Soviet intelligence had compromised American nuclear plans. From the outside, looking through the distorting lens of suspicion and limited information, defensive preparations looked identical to offensive preparations. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, the Soviet chief of general staff, was one of the most capable military minds of his generation. He had studied American nuclear strategy extensively and had a sophisticated understanding of how the United States thought about nuclear war. But even his analytical skills couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of incomplete information and institutional paranoia. The pattern is clear, Ogarkov said to the assembled military leadership. Either the Americans are preparing for war, or they're creating the appearance of preparation to intimidate us. Either way, we cannot afford to be caught unprepared. What do you recommend, Comrade Marshal? Asked General Secretary Andropov. We must increase our readiness further. I recommend moving to full combat alert for all strategic forces. This accomplishes two objectives. It ensures we can respond if the Americans do attack, and it signals to them that we will not be intimidated or caught by surprise. Andropov, sick and suspicious, saw the logic in this recommendation. But he was also experienced enough to understand the risks. And if the Americans see us go to full alert, how will they respond? They will recognize that we are serious, that we will not allow ourselves to be threatened. Or, Andropov said quietly, they will see it as confirmation that we are preparing to attack them, and they will increase their own readiness in response. Where does this spiral end, Comrade Marshal? The question hung in the air without answer, because the truth was that no one knew where the spiral would end. It might end in mutual recognition of the danger and step back from the brink. Or it might end in miscalculation, accident, or the terrible fulfillment of Cold War logic in nuclear fire. Back at Stapleton Airport, FBI Special Agent Chen's investigation had made a breakthrough. The mystery man from the security footage had been identified through painstaking work with the airlines. He had purchased a ticket for United Flight 892 to Chicago, departing at 7:30 a.m. on November 15th. The ticket had been bought with cash 3 days earlier, and the name on it was Peter Morrison. Peter Morrison did not exist. The social security number on the ticket purchase form was fake. The address in Lakewood, Colorado, listed on the form was a vacant lot. The phone number was disconnected. We have an agent, Chen reported to his superiors. Someone with tradecraft skills, someone who knows how to create a cover identity and buy a ticket without leaving a real trail. Someone who was at that lost and found office during the exact window when the briefcase was there and who left Denver on the first available flight afterward. The good news was that Peter Morrison had departed Denver before the briefcase contents could have been transmitted to Soviet handlers in the United States. If he had photographed the documents, the film or data was with him on United Flight 892 to Chicago. The bad news was that he was now gone, disappeared into the vastness of the American transportation system with a 2-hour head start before anyone even knew to look for him. Pull the passenger manifest for that flight, Chun ordered. I want to know who he was sitting next to, who might have seen him. Pull security footage from O'Hare for when that flight landed. Find out where Peter Morrison went after he got off that plane. While this investigation proceeded, another piece of the puzzle was falling into place at the NSA. Analysts monitoring Soviet communications had detected an anomaly in the traffic patterns from the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. An encrypted burst transmission had been sent at 9:15 a.m. Pacific time, approximately 2 hours after the mystery man had left Denver, and 1 hour after United Flight 892 had landed in Chicago. The transmission had been sent to a Soviet communications satellite and was beyond current NSA ability to decrypt in real time. But the timing was suggestive. If Peter Morrison had traveled from Denver to Chicago and then made his way to another location with Soviet consulate access, the timeline would work for a report to Moscow about a successful intelligence operation. We can't prove it's connected, the NSA analyst admitted. But the timing is suspicious, and the San Francisco consulate has been quiet for weeks. This burst of activity right now, today, could be coincidental, or it could be a report about the briefcase. These pieces of intelligence, the CIA's assessment of probable compromise, the identification of a possible Soviet agent of the lost and found, the suspicious transmission from San Francisco, came together in a National Security Council meeting at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The picture they painted was deeply troubling. It appeared increasingly likely that the briefcase incident had not been a simple accident, but a sophisticated Soviet intelligence operation. An agent had been in place to verify the operation's success and had successfully exfiltrated from the scene before the security lockdown. A report had possibly been transmitted to Moscow. If this assessment was correct, then the Soviet Union now had detailed knowledge of American nuclear war plans. They knew targets, they knew timing, they knew command and control procedures. They could use this information to reposition their forces, to harden priority targets, to develop countermeasures against American strategy. Worse, they would know that the United States knew they had this information. The American response to the security breach had made that clear. So the Soviets would expect American plans to change. They would be watching for those changes, and they would interpret the changes as final preparation for war. We're trapped, observed CIA Director Casey. If we don't change our nuclear posture, we're vulnerable. If we do change it, we confirm their worst fears about our intentions. There's no good option. President Reagan listened to the assessments, the probabilities, the scenarios, and the recommendations. He thought about the weight of nuclear responsibility, about the millions of lives that hung on the decisions made in this room. He thought about his recent diary entry after watching The Day After, about his growing conviction that nuclear weapons could never be used and must eventually be eliminated. But elimination was a long-term dream. The short-term reality was managing this crisis without triggering the war that nuclear weapons were supposed to prevent. I want to try something different, Reagan said finally. I want to write a personal letter to General Secretary Andropov, not through official channels, not in diplomatic language, but a direct, human appeal from one leader to another. I want to explain what happened, why we're doing what we're doing, and ask him to step back from this ledge we're both standing on. There was silence in the room. Personal correspondence between American and Soviet leaders was not unprecedented. Kennedy and Khrushchev had exchanged letters during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was unusual and carried its own risks. It might work, Secretary of State Shultz said slowly, or it might be seen as a sign of weakness, an indication that we're afraid of their response. I'm more afraid of a nuclear war that neither of us wants than I am of looking weak, Reagan replied. Draft the letter. I'll send it through the hotline tonight. As the meeting adjourned, each participant carried away their own fears about the path ahead. They had managed crises before. They had navigated the treacherous waters of Cold War confrontation. But this felt different. This felt like standing on the edge of an abyss, where one false step could send humanity tumbling into the darkness. In Moscow, the Kremlin was lit against the November night. In Washington, the White House lights burned as staffers worked to craft a letter that might prevent the end of the world. And somewhere between these two capitals, in the vast spaces of a world transformed by nuclear weapons into a single community of potential annihilation, ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware of how close they stood to extraordinary catastrophe. The crisis was entering its most dangerous phase. The briefcase had been found, but the damage was done. The spiral of escalation continued, fed by fear, suspicion, and the terrible momentum of institutions designed for conflict. And time was running out to step back from the brink. Colonel James Mitchell sat in a windowless interrogation room at Peterson Air Force Base, his military career disintegrating around him like ash. It was 6 p.m. Mountain Time, 13 hours since he had picked up the wrong briefcase. Across the table sat two officers from Air Force Office of Special Investigations, their faces impassive as they worked through their checklist of questions for the fourth time. "Walk me through your state of mind at the security checkpoint again, Colonel," said Major Susan Rodriguez, the senior investigator. "What were you thinking about?" Mitchell had answered this question before, but he answered it again, his voice hoarse with fatigue and shame. He described Sarah's accident, the hospital visit, his wife's disappointment, his certainty that he could manage both his personal crisis and his professional duty. He described the moment of distraction, the fatal lapse in attention that had led him to grab the wrong briefcase. What the investigators were really trying to determine was whether Mitchell's error had been genuine or whether he had deliberately switched the briefcases as part of an espionage operation. The possibility seemed absurd to Mitchell. He had served his country faithfully for 30 years, but he understood that in the world of counterintelligence, nothing could be taken on faith. Trust had to be verified, loyalty had to be proven, and even distinguished service could hide betrayal. "Colonel Mitchell," Rodriguez continued, "can you account for your movements and contacts over the past 6 months? Any unusual meetings, any financial irregularities, any approaches by foreign nationals?" "I've already been through this," Mitchell said, his patience finally fraying. "I'm not a spy. I made a mistake, a terrible, catastrophic mistake, but it was a mistake. I didn't betray my country." "We have to be certain, sir," Rodriguez replied, not unkindly. "You understand that." Mitchell did understand. He also understood that his certainty of his own innocence was irrelevant. He would be investigated, polygraphed, surveilled, and scrutinized until the investigators were satisfied. His bank records would be examined, his phone calls traced, his associates interviewed. It was the process, and the process was merciless. In another part of the base, Mitchell's family waited. Margaret Mitchell, his wife of 26 years, sat in a base visitor's room with their 2 daughters. Sarah, 19, and still showing bruises from her accident, and Jennifer, 23 and pregnant with her first child. They had been brought to Peterson under military escort, told only that there was a security situation involving James and that they needed to be available for interviews. "What kind of security situation?" Margaret demanded of the Air Force liaison officer assigned to them. "What has Jim done?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, ma'am," the officer replied. "But I assure you that Colonel Mitchell is not in any danger, and neither are you. This is purely precautionary." What the liaison officer didn't say was that Mitchell's family was also under investigation. In espionage cases, family members were often involved, either as willing accomplices or unwitting couriers. Every aspect of their lives would be examined for anything unusual, any hint of unexplained income or suspicious contacts. Margaret Mitchell, a teacher who had followed her husband through a dozen different postings over 2.5 decades, felt the foundations of her life shifting beneath her. She had always known that Jim's work was important, classified, sensitive, but had been abstract, distant from their daily life. Now the classified world had crashed into their reality with devastating force. "Is Daddy going to prison?" Sarah asked quietly. "No," Margaret said firmly, though she had no idea if this was true. "Your father is a good man. He would never do anything to hurt his country. This is just a misunderstanding. It will be straightened out." But even as she said it, Margaret wondered. The past 6 months had been difficult. Jim had been distant, preoccupied, stressed in ways she hadn't seen before. She had attributed it to his new assignment, to the weight of responsibility. But what if there had been something else? What if there were aspects of her husband's life that she didn't know about? The thought felt like a betrayal, even as it formed. But in the paranoid calculus of Cold War security, doubt was everywhere. No one was above suspicion. Trust was a luxury that national security could not afford. Meanwhile, in Denver, Robert Thornton was experiencing his own surreal encounter with the national security apparatus. The pharmaceutical salesman had been brought to the FBI's Denver field office and had spent the past 3 hours answering questions about his movements, his briefcase, his contacts, and his background. "Mr. Thornton," Special Agent Sean said, "I need you to think very carefully. When you were at the security checkpoint this morning, did you notice anyone paying particular attention to you? Anyone who seemed interested in your briefcase?" Thornton, thoroughly bewildered by the whole experience, shook his head. "I don't think so. It was early, not many people around. I just went through security like I always do and headed to my gate." "And you're certain you've never been approached by anyone claiming to represent a foreign government? No unusual offers of money or assistance? No one asking you to carry packages or messages?" "No, nothing like that. Look, I sell pharmaceuticals to hospitals and clinics. That's it. I'm not involved in anything classified or sensitive. Why won't anyone tell me what this is about?" Chin couldn't tell Thornton that his briefcase, however briefly, had been in possession of an Air Force officer carrying nuclear secrets. He couldn't explain that Thornton's ordinary sales materials had inadvertently become part of a potential international crisis. National security classification meant that Thornton would probably never know the full story of what had happened. "I'm sorry, sir," Chen said. "I can't provide details, but I can tell you that you're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing. We just need to verify certain facts about this morning's events." Thornton would return to his life, to his sales calls and his hotel rooms and his ordinary existence, carrying with him only the memory of a strange day when federal agents had questioned him intensely about nothing he could understand. It was a small violation of normalcy, a reminder that in the world of national security, ordinary citizens could be swept up in extraordinary events without ever knowing why. Back in Washington, President Reagan was in the Oval Office, working on his letter to Yuri Andropov. He had dismissed his speechwriters, wanting to craft this message in his own words, from his own convictions. The letter needed to be personal, authentic, and persuasive. He wrote in longhand on a legal pad, crossing out phrases, starting over, searching for the right words to bridge the enormous gulf of suspicion between Washington and Moscow. "Dear General Secretary Andropov," he began, "I am writing to you as one man who bears responsibility for the lives of millions to another man who carries the same burden." Reagan wrote about the briefcase incident, explaining in simple terms what had happened and what it meant. He wrote about the human capacity for error, about the dangers of misunderstanding in an age of nuclear weapons, about his genuine conviction that the United States had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union. "We are both products of our times and our systems," he wrote. "We see the world through different ideological lenses, but we share a common humanity and a common responsibility. We both have children and grandchildren. We both want them to inherit a world that continues to exist." The letter was unlike any official communication that would normally pass between the two leaders. It was vulnerable in a way that statesmen rarely allowed themselves to be, acknowledging fear and uncertainty rather than projecting only strength and resolve. Secretary of State Schultz, reading the draft, felt a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mr. President, this is powerful. but I worry it might be seen as weakness. George, at this point, I'm more worried about looking weak than I am about actually starting a nuclear war, Reagan replied. If being honest about what happened and how we feel is weakness, then I'll accept that label. Because the alternative, continuing this escalation based on pride and posturing, is insanity. The letter was encrypted and transmitted over the hotline at 8:47 p.m. Eastern Time. In Moscow, it was 4:47 a.m. on November 16th. Andropov would read it in a few hours, and his response would help determine whether this crisis could be contained. While waiting for that response, another element of the personal dimension began to emerge. At Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska, the officers who would actually execute nuclear war plans were dealing with their own psychological burden. Major Patricia Walters, a Minuteman missile launch control officer, sat in her underground capsule with her partner, Lieutenant Thomas Drake, as their shift began at 6 p.m. Central Time. They had been on alert status for 4 hours, longer than usual. The enhanced readiness meant they were running more frequent checks of their systems, maintaining higher levels of attention, staying closer to the edge of actual launch readiness. "You think this is real?" Drake asked during a rare moment of downtime. "You think we might actually turn our keys today?" Walters didn't answer immediately. The question touched on something they rarely discussed: the possibility that their training, their drills, their endless preparations might become reality. They had both been selected for this duty based on psychological profiles that suggested they could follow orders under extreme stress. They had both sworn they would execute their launch orders if they came, no matter their personal feelings. But sitting in the capsule, with enhanced alert status active and tensions higher than she had ever experienced, Walters found herself confronting the reality behind the abstractions. "I hope not," she said finally. "God, I hope not." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the instruments and controls that could unleash weapons capable of destroying cities. The weight of that responsibility, always present, felt heavier now. They were cogs in a machine designed for Armageddon, and the machine was humming with unusual energy. "If the orders come," Drake said quietly, "will you turn your key?" It was the forbidden question, the one they weren't supposed to ask each other. The whole system of nuclear command and control was built on the assumption that officers would follow orders without hesitation, without philosophical debate, without moral uncertainty. Doubt was the enemy of deterrence. "I don't know," Walters admitted, and the honesty of that answer frightened them both. In the Soviet Union, similar conversations were taking place in missile silos and submarine control rooms, in bomber cockpits and command bunkers. Young men and women trained to execute orders that would end civilization were confronting the possibility that this might be the day those orders came. Captain Alexander Moiseev, commanding K, 324 deep beneath the Norwegian Sea, faced his own moment of moral reckoning. He had received further orders at 2,100 hours Moscow time. Prepare for possible launch operations. Load targeting data. Run final systems checks. Be ready. Moiseev had joined the Soviet Navy out of genuine patriotic conviction. He believed in defending his country, in maintaining the strategic balance that prevented American aggression. But he had also hoped, somewhere deep in his heart, that he would never actually have to use his weapons. That deterrence would hold. That the world would find a way to step back from the nuclear abyss. Now, with the submarine at heightened alert and tensions escalating hourly, that hope seemed naive. He gathered his senior officers in the submarine's tiny wardroom and spoke to them with unusual candor. "Comrades, I want you to understand what we may be asked to do in the coming hours. If we receive launch orders, they will be authenticated through proper channels. We will verify them according to procedure. And if they are genuine, we will execute them." He paused, looking at the young faces around him. Somewhere in their 20s, barely older than his own son. "But I also want you to understand that if we launch our missiles, we will be participating in the destruction of much of human civilization. Our targets are American cities. Millions of people will die, and the Americans will respond against our homeland. Everything and everyone we love will likely be destroyed in return." "Then why would we do it?" asked the young lieutenant, his voice barely above a whisper. Because if we don't, Moiseev replied heavily, and if the Americans are truly preparing to attack us, then our country will be destroyed anyway, with no possibility of response or revenge. That is the logic of nuclear deterrence. That is the trap we are all caught in. The conversation was extraordinary, a breach of military discipline and Soviet ideological certainty. But Moiseev felt his crew deserved honesty. If they were going to participate in the end of the world, they should do so with their eyes open, understanding the full weight of what they carried. I pray it doesn't come to that, he concluded. But if it does, I need to know I can count on each of you to do your duty. Around the table, the officers nodded. What else could they do? They were part of a system larger than themselves, caught in a logic that had its own momentum, its own terrible coherence. Back in Washington, Reagan's letter to Andropov was being analyzed by Soviet intelligence even before Andropov himself read it. The KGB's cryptographic service had decrypted it within minutes of its transmission, and analysts were examining every word for hidden meanings, veiled threats, or deceptive language. The consensus among the analysts was split. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at communication, a sincere effort to prevent escalation. Others viewed it as sophisticated psychological warfare, designed to lull Soviet leadership into complacency before an attack. This ambiguity reflected a deeper problem in Soviet-American relations. The two sides had spent so many years assuming the worst about each other that genuine gestures of peace were indistinguishable from clever deceptions. Trust had eroded to the point where honesty looked like manipulation and sincerity seemed suspicious. When Andropov finally read the letter at 8:30 a.m. Moscow time on November 16th, he was alone in his office in the Kremlin. He read it twice, slowly, trying to gauge its authenticity. Reagan's personal tone was unusual for official correspondence. The admission of human error, the appeal to common humanity, these were not typical elements of Cold War communication. But Andropov was a former KGB chairman, trained in suspicion, experienced in deception. He had spent his career assuming that the Americans were capable of any duplicity. He was also genuinely ill, in pain, and increasingly paranoid about Western intentions. The combination made him particularly susceptible to worst-case thinking. He called in his closest advisors, Marshal Ogarkov, KGB Chairman Chebarkov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. They discussed the letter for 2 hours, debating its implications. It could be genuine, Gromyko suggested. Reagan may actually be trying to prevent a crisis from spinning out of control. Or it could be exactly what he would say if you were preparing to attack us, Ogarkov countered. Create the appearance of seeking peace while actually finalizing war preparations. It's classic deception. Chebarkov offered a more nuanced view. Our intelligence suggests the briefcase incident may indeed have been accidental, but their military response has been significant and coordinated. We must consider both possibilities, that this is a genuine accident being managed, or that the accident is a cover for actual war preparation. Andropov made his decision. We will respond to Reagan's letter with appropriate diplomatic language, neither accepting his explanation entirely nor rejecting it outright. But we will not lower our alert status. We will continue to watch American actions, not just their words. If this is genuine, their military activity should decrease over the next day. If it is deception, we will see further preparations for war. The response that went back to Washington was polite but non-committal, almost identical in tone to the previous Soviet message. Reading it in the Situation Room, President Reagan felt a wave of frustration and fear. His attempt at personal diplomacy had failed to break through the wall of Soviet suspicion. They don't believe us, he said simply. No, sir, they don't, McFarlane confirmed. They're going to watch and wait, which means we're still in a crisis footing, and they're still on high alert. The personal element, Reagan's letter, Mitchell's human error, the moral struggles of launch officers, had proven unable to overcome the institutional logic of the Cold War. Individual humans, no matter how sincere or well-intentioned, were trapped in a system that operated according to its own rules, its own assumptions, its own terrible momentum. In Denver, the FBI investigation had made another breakthrough. Security footage from O'Hare Airport in Chicago showed a man matching Peter Morrison's description leaving the terminal and getting into a taxi at 10:23 a.m. Central Time. The taxi company's records indicated the passenger had been dropped off at a shopping mall in suburban Skokie, Illinois. From there, the trail went cold. No more security cameras, no more ticket purchases, no more traces. Peter Morrison had vanished into the American heartland like smoke. But the FBI had something else. Facial recognition analysis using the latest computer technology. The fuzzy image from Stapleton had been enhanced and run through databases of known Soviet intelligence operatives. And they had found a possible match. The man might be Viktor Shimov, a KGB officer who had defected to the United States in 1980 and provided extensive information about Soviet intelligence operations. But Shimov was supposedly in protective custody, living under a new identity, completely cut off from his former handlers. Could he be a double agent? Someone suggested in the FBI briefing. Could he have pretended to defect while actually maintaining his Soviet contacts? It was possible. Anything was possible in the Hall of Mirrors that was counterintelligence work. Trust no one. Verify everything. Assume deception until proven otherwise. But there was another possibility. The facial recognition might be wrong. The technology was still primitive, prone to false positives. The resemblance might be coincidental. Peter Morrison might be someone else entirely, perhaps not even a Soviet agent, but an operative for a different intelligence service or a domestic threat that had nothing to do with the Cold War. The investigation continued, pursuing multiple leads simultaneously, trying to construct a complete picture from fragmentary evidence. But time was running out. With each passing hour, the man they sought was getting further away, the trail growing colder, the chances of finding him diminishing. As November 16th dawned over the American East Coast, the crisis entered its 24th hour. The briefcase was secure, but its contents might be compromised. Soviet forces remained on high alert. American nuclear posture was being adjusted. The two superpowers were locked in a dangerous dance, each interpreting the other's defensive measures as offensive preparations. And at the heart of it all were individuals. Mitchell and his family, Walters and Drake in their missile silo, Moiseev beneath the Norwegian Sea, Reagan and Andropov carrying the weight of nuclear decision-making, trying to navigate a crisis that had outgrown any individual's ability to control. The human element had created the crisis through a simple mistake. But the human element seemed powerless to resolve it. The machinery of the Cold War, built over decades of mutual suspicion and nuclear logic, had its own momentum. And that momentum was carrying the world toward a precipice that everyone could see, but no one seemed able to avoid. November 16th, 1983, 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time. The National Military Command Center deep beneath the Pentagon was operating at peak activity levels normally reserved for actual combat operations. On the massive display screens covering the walls, symbols and data streams tracked the global disposition of American and Soviet military forces. General Peter Williams, the senior duty officer, stood before the central display, watching the situation evolve with growing unease. His career had spanned 4 decades, from Korea to Vietnam to the current Cold War standoff, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The Soviets weren't just maintaining heightened alert status. They were actively repositioning forces in ways that suggested genuine preparation for conflict. Talk to me about their submarine movements. Williams ordered his intelligence officer. Sir, we're tracking 12 Soviet SSBNs currently on patrol, up from the usual 8. They've deployed additional boats from the Northern and Pacific fleets within the past 18 hours. They're taking up positions that would optimize them for strikes against the continental United States and NATO targets in Europe. Williams studied the display. Each submarine carried enough nuclear firepower to destroy multiple cities. Their deployment patterns showed sophisticated planning and coordination. This wasn't just heightened alert. This was strategic repositioning for potential combat operations. What about their land-based forces? Mobile ICBM launchers are dispersing from their garrisons across the Soviet Union. We're seeing increased activity at their SS-18 and SS-19 silo fields. Command posts are going to protected status. Their early warning radars have gone to maximum sensitivity. Every indicator pointed in the same direction. The Soviet military was preparing for the possibility of nuclear war. They were taking exactly the steps that Soviet doctrine called for in the period immediately before conflict. American intelligence had studied these patterns for decades. Now they were watching them unfold in real time. Is there any indication they're actually preparing to strike first? Williams asked, knowing the answer might determine the next step in the escalation spiral. Nothing definitive, sir. But their posture is consistent with either preparing to receive an attack or preparing to launch one. From their perspective, those might look the same. That was the heart of the problem. In nuclear strategy, offense and defense were mirror images. The same preparations that allowed you to survive an attack also enabled you to launch one. Without being able to read minds, without perfect intelligence on intentions versus capabilities, you had to assume the worst. At the White House, President Reagan had barely slept. He returned to the Situation Room at 4:15 a.m., summoned by news of the latest Soviet force movements. The fatigue showed on his face, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. Mr. President, CIA Director Casey briefed, the Soviets are moving to what we assess as maximum readiness short of actual launch operations. If this were a crisis with a clear trigger event, like Cuba in '62, we'd say we were hours away from potential conflict. But this isn't like Cuba, Reagan said. There's no missile deployment, no naval quarantine, no clear provocation. This is a crisis born of misunderstanding and mutual fear, which makes it potentially more dangerous, sir, McFarlane interjected. In Cuba, both sides understood what the other wanted. Kennedy wanted the missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev wanted assurances about Turkey and Cuba's security. There was a deal to be made. Here, there's nothing concrete to negotiate. We can't give them what they want because what they want is for us not to attack them, and we're not planning to attack them. But we can't prove our intentions, only our capabilities. Secretary of Defense Weinberger had a recommendation. Mr. President, I think we need to consider signaling our peaceful intentions through unilateral force movements. Pull back some of our bombers from forward alert status. Stand down some of our exercises. Give the Soviets concrete evidence that we're not preparing for war. And if they interpret that as weakness, asked General Vesey. If they see us backing down and conclude they can push harder, then we're damned if we do and damned if we don't, Weinberger replied. But I'd rather risk looking weak than risk stumbling into a nuclear war. Reagan made a decision that would define his crisis management approach. I want to implement a series of visible de-escalatory moves. Stand down Able Archer immediately. NATO can finish the exercise another time. Reduce our bomber alert rate by 20%. Cancel any exercises or deployments scheduled for the next 72 hours that could be misinterpreted. And I want to communicate each of these steps directly to the Soviets through the hotline before we implement them, so they understand what we're doing and why. It was a gamble. Unilateral de-escalation could be seen as strategic weakness or as genuine peace overture. But Reagan believed the risk of continued escalation was greater than the risk of appearing weak. And if the Soviets don't reciprocate, McFarlane asked, then at least we'll know we tried, Reagan said. At least history will record that we attempted to step back from the brink. The first message went over the hotline at 5 a.m. Eastern Time, announcing the immediate termination of Able Archer 83 and explaining that NATO forces would return to normal readiness levels. Subsequent messages over the next 2 hours detailed each de-escalatory step as it was implemented. In Moscow, these messages were received with a mixture of relief and suspicion. The termination of Able Archer was significant. The exercise had been a major source of Soviet anxiety. But was this genuine de-escalation, or was it a deceptive maneuver designed to lower Soviet guard? Yuri Andropov, increasingly ill and exhausted by the crisis, convened an emergency Politburo meeting at 2 p.m. Moscow time. The leadership of the Soviet Union, the men who controlled the other half of the world's nuclear arsenal, gathered to decide how to respond to the American moves. "Comrades, we face a critical decision," Andropov began, his voice weak but determined. "The Americans have taken steps that appear to be de-escalatory. They have ended their exercise. They are reducing their alert status. The question before us is whether this is genuine or whether it is deception." Minister of Defense Dmitry Ustinov, a hardliner who had overseen the Soviet military buildup for decades, was skeptical. "Comrade General Secretary, the Americans have deceived us before. They speak of peace while preparing for war. We cannot afford to trust their words when their actions over the past day have been so threatening." But Foreign Minister Gromyko offered a different perspective. "We must also consider the consequences of continued escalation. If we maintain our current alert status while the Americans reduce theirs, we become the aggressive party. We risk Western unity solidifying against us. We risk domestic economic consequences from prolonged military readiness. And we risk the very nuclear war we seek to avoid." The debate continued for 2 hours, revealing deep divisions within Soviet leadership. Some saw the American moves as vindication of Soviet strength. The Americans were backing down because Soviet resolve had frightened them. Others saw an opportunity to reduce tensions before they spiraled completely out of control. Andropov, who had initiated Operation Ryan out of genuine fear of American attack, found himself confronting the consequences of his own paranoia. The intelligence apparatus he had built was telling him to suspect American deception. But his political instincts and his knowledge of nuclear weapons' destructive power were telling him to seek a way out of this crisis. And in the minds of leaders on both sides, a terrifying awareness had crystallized. They had come within hours, perhaps minutes, of decisions that could have ended human civilization. Not through malice or even through deliberate aggression, but through the compound effects of human error, institutional paranoia, and the terrible logic of mutual nuclear deterrence. The world had dodged a bullet it never knew was fired. Life would go on, people would go about their daily routines, and almost no one would ever know how close they had come to annihilation on November 15th to 16th, 1983. But in classified briefings and secret debriefings, in presidential diaries and military after-action reports, the lesson was clear. The nuclear balance was far more precarious than anyone had wanted to admit. A single mistake, a moment of inattention, a briefcase picked up in error. Any of these could trigger a cascade of misunderstandings that led to the end of everything. The breaking point had been reached, and by the narrowest of margins, disaster had been averted. But everyone involved knew that next time, they might not be so lucky. 3 weeks after the crisis, Colonel James Mitchell sat in his living room in Colorado Springs, officially relieved of duty pending the outcome of the Air Force's investigation. The house was quiet. Margaret was at work, the girls had returned to their own lives, and Mitchell was alone with his thoughts and his shame. The official findings had been clear: no evidence of espionage, no indication of deliberate wrongdoing, but a catastrophic failure of security protocols that could not be overlooked. Mitchell would not face criminal charges. He would not be court-martialed, but his military career was over. At 52, after 30 years of service, he would be allowed to retire with full benefits, a tacit acknowledgement that his record of distinguished service merited some consideration. It was more generous than he had expected. It was far less than his life had been. A letter sat on the coffee table, still in its official Air Force envelope. Mitchell had read it 3 times already, but he picked it up again, his eyes moving over the words that ended his professional life. While acknowledging your 3 decades of exemplary service to the United States Air Force and your nation, the investigating board finds that your failure to maintain positive control of classified materials represents a breach of security protocols that cannot be mitigated by past performance. Therefore, it is recommended that you be retired from active duty at your current rank, with all associated benefits and honors, effective December 31st, 1983. 30 years reduced to a paragraph. A lifetime of service ending not in glory or satisfaction, but in the quiet humiliation of forced retirement. The phone rang, breaking his reverie. It was General Hastings. "Jim, I wanted to call before the news becomes official, Hastings said, his voice carrying genuine regret. The retirement board approved the findings. You'll be out by year's end. Understand, sir, Mitchell replied, his voice flat. For what it's worth, Jim, I know this wasn't malice or carelessness in the usual sense. You were dealing with a family crisis. You were exhausted. You made a human mistake. That doesn't change the consequences, does it, sir? No, it doesn't. But it should inform how you think about this going forward. You didn't betray your country. You didn't compromise national security. We've confirmed the briefcase wasn't accessed. You had a moment of distraction at the worst possible time. It happens to be a moment that could have had catastrophic consequences, but that's the nature of the responsibility you carried. After the call ended, Mitchell sat in silence, wrestling with the question that had haunted him since that morning in Denver. How did a good man, a careful man, a man who had never failed in 3 decades of service, make such a catastrophic error? He knew the answer, of course. He had been human, tired, worried about his daughter, stressed by competing responsibilities. For just a few seconds, his attention had wandered, and in those seconds, he had picked up the wrong briefcase. It was that simple and that devastating. What haunted him more was the knowledge of what his mistake had almost caused. He had been briefed on the full scope of the crisis, the escalation spiral, how close the world had come to nuclear war. Millions of people, going about their ordinary lives, had been hours away from annihilation because of his error. That knowledge would stay with him for the rest of his life, a weight no retirement ceremony or generous pension could lift. In Washington, a very different kind of aftermath was unfolding. The crisis had prompted a comprehensive review of nuclear command and control procedures, security protocols, and crisis communication systems. A classified working group, drawing members from the NSC, Defense Department, State Department, and intelligence community, was examining every aspect of what had gone wrong and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Eleanor Marsh from the CIA had been assigned to lead the working group's intelligence assessment component. She sat in a windowless conference room in the executive office building, surrounded by documents and reports, tried to extract lessons from the near catastrophe. The fundamental problem, she explained to the working group, is that our nuclear posture is built on assumptions of rational decision-making and clear communication. But the briefcase incident demonstrated that even when both sides are acting rationally within their own frameworks, the interaction can produce irrational and dangerous outcomes. She pointed to a timeline displayed on the wall, showing the parallel escalations. American security response, Soviet interpretation, American force adjustments, Soviet alert increases, each step logical in itself, but collectively creating a spiral toward disaster. We assumed the Soviets would understand that our military activities were defensive responses to a security breach. They assumed our security breach was either a cover story for attack preparations, or, if genuine, evidence that we were vulnerable and might strike first to prevent exploitation of the compromised information. Both assumptions were reasonable within each side's framework. Both led to escalatory actions. So what's the solution? Asked a Pentagon representative. How do we maintain security while avoiding dangerous misunderstandings? We need redundancy in communication, Marsh replied. Multiple channels, multiple methods of conveying intentions. We need pre-established protocols for exactly these kinds of incidents. And we need to accept that perfect security and perfect transparency are mutually exclusive goals. We have to find the right balance. The working group's recommendations would eventually lead to improvements in the hotline communication system, new protocols for managing security incidents involving nuclear materials, and enhanced coordination between diplomatic and military channels during crises. But these were technical fixes to what was ultimately a human problem: the difficulty of maintaining trust and clear communication in a relationship defined by mutual fear and suspicion. In Moscow, a parallel review was taking place. The Soviet leadership, shaken by how close they had come to war over what turned out to be an American accident, was reassessing Operation Ryan and the assumptions that had driven their paranoid interpretation of American actions. Yuri Andropov, now confined to bed by his worsening illness, received a classified report on the incident from KGB Chairman Chebrikov. The report acknowledged that Soviet intelligence had misinterpreted the American response, seeing malicious intent where there had been only bureaucratic crisis management. "We need to be more careful," Andropov said weakly, "more discriminating in our assessments. We cannot afford to see every American action as preparation for war." But even as he said it, Andropov knew the deeper problem. The Soviet system was built on suspicion, on the assumption that the capitalist world sought the destruction of socialism. That ideological framework made paranoid interpretations not just possible, but almost inevitable. Changing the system's tendency toward worst-case thinking would require changing the system itself, a task far beyond the capability of any individual leader, even one with Andropov's authority. In the months that followed, Soviet military doctrine would make subtle adjustments, building in more checks before assuming American hostile intent. But the fundamental dynamic of mutual suspicion would remain largely unchanged. For Alexei Petrov, the KGB officer who had been arrested during the crisis, the aftermath was bleak. He had been a successful deep-cover agent, operating undetected for 6 years, gathering valuable intelligence on American defense and intelligence capabilities. Now his career was over, his network was being rolled up, and he faced decades in American prison. During his interrogation by FBI counterintelligence specialists, Petrov had been told about the crisis his presence at the Lost and Found office had inadvertently triggered. The irony was not lost on him. He had been running a routine intelligence operation, completely unaware that his timing and location had made him the prime suspect in a far more significant security breach. "You almost started World War III without meaning to," his interrogator had said. Petrov, who had spent his adult life serving Soviet intelligence, was haunted by this knowledge. He had been trained to see his work as noble, as defending his country against American aggression. But in the end, his actions had brought the world closer to nuclear destruction than any genuine act of espionage might have accomplished. The exchange that eventually freed Petrov, traded for an American intelligence officer held in the Soviet Union, would not occur for 3 years. In the meantime, he sat in a federal prison cell, contemplating the gap between intention and consequence, between the spy games he had played and the nuclear reality those games operated within. For the ordinary people who had been swept up in the crisis, Martha Henshaw at the Lost and Found office, Robert Thornton, the pharmaceutical salesman, the air traffic controllers and security personnel at Stapleton Airport, the aftermath brought only fragmentary understanding of what they had been part of. Martha Henshaw never learned the full story. She knew only that the briefcase she had logged and stored had been the subject of intense federal investigation, that she had been interviewed repeatedly about every detail of that morning, and that federal agents had thanked her for her cooperation before disappearing from her life as suddenly as they had entered it. She would sometimes wonder, in the years that followed, what had been in that unremarkable brown leather briefcase that had caused such extraordinary attention. But she never knew about the nuclear war plans, the crisis it had triggered, or how close the world had come to destruction while she went about her ordinary duties in an airport Lost and Found office. This selective knowledge was deliberate. The crisis had been classified at the highest levels. Only those with direct need to know were briefed on the full scope of what had happened. The general public would never learn that on November 15th to 16th, 1983, a lost briefcase had almost triggered nuclear Armageddon. President Reagan, writing in his diary on November 30th, 1983, reflected on the crisis with characteristic candor. "I've learned something that troubles me deeply. We came very close to a nuclear exchange this month, and most of the world will never know it. A simple mistake, a tired officer picking up the wrong briefcase, set in motion a chain of events that could have ended civilization. If that's how fragile our nuclear peace is, if we're that close to catastrophe at all times, then we need to rethink the entire framework of deterrence. Nuclear weapons are supposed to prevent war, but they might actually make war more likely through accident or misunderstanding. I'm more convinced than ever that we need to find a way to reduce and eventually eliminate these weapons." This conviction would shape Reagan's approach to arms control in his second term, leading eventually to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the beginning of serious nuclear reductions. The briefcase crisis, known to almost no one, had helped catalyze a shift in thinking that would help end the Cold War. But that was years in the future. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on ensuring such an incident could never happen again. New protocols were established for SJP couriers, two-person teams rather than solo officers, additional security measures at airports, enhanced verification procedures at every step of the transit. The combination lock on classified briefcases was redesigned to be more distinctive, harder to confuse with commercial luggage. Training was enhanced to emphasize the importance of constant vigilance even in routine operations. These were small changes, technical improvements to a vast and complex system, but they represented a recognition of human fallibility, an acknowledgement that even the most dedicated and professional individuals could make mistakes under stress, and that the system needed to be resilient enough to survive those mistakes. 6 months after the incident, a classified symposium was held at the National Defense University in Washington. Military officers, intelligence officials, diplomats, and academic experts gathered to analyze the crisis and extract lessons for future crisis management. The discussion ranged across multiple dimensions: technical security failures, intelligence assessment shortcomings, communication breakdowns, and the psychological factors that had driven escalation. But the most illuminating presentations focused on the Soviet perspective, based on intelligence gathered in the months since the crisis. What we learned, explained to CIA analysts who had spent weeks interviewing defectors and analyzing intercepted Soviet communications, is that the Soviets were genuinely terrified. This wasn't posturing or political theater. Their leadership genuinely believed we might be preparing to attack them. Operation Ryan had primed them to see exactly what they saw in our response to the briefcase incident. Unusual military activity, command posts go to alert, changes in force readiness. From their perspective, all the warning indicators were flashing red. This revelation was sobering for the American officials present. They had assumed Soviet escalation was calculated, a deliberate attempt to intimidate or gain advantage. The possibility that it had been driven by genuine fear forced a reevaluation of Cold War dynamics. If they were that scared, observed a State Department official, then our deterrent posture might be counterproductive. We think we're preventing war through strength, but we might actually be making war more likely by frightening them into preemptive action. The debate that followed would influence American strategic thinking for years to come, contributing to a gradual shift from pure deterrence toward arms control and tension reduction. For Major Patricia Walters and Lieutenant Thomas Drake, the missile launch officers who had confronted the possibility of turning their keys in actual combat, the aftermath brought its own challenges. They had been debriefed extensively about their psychological state during the crisis, about their doubts and fears. The Air Force was concerned. Launch officers were supposed to execute orders without hesitation. The fact that Walters had admitted uncertainty, "I don't know," when asked if she would turn her key, was potentially disqualifying for continued service in the role. But the debriefing psychologist, Dr. Raymond Chun, offered a different interpretation in his report. Lieutenant Walters' admission of uncertainty should not be seen as a failure of psychological fitness. Rather, it demonstrates appropriate moral awareness of the consequences of nuclear launch. An officer who claims absolute certainty about their willingness to execute launch orders without any emotional or moral struggle is either lying or psychologically damaged. The goal should not be to create automatons who will launch without thought, but rather to ensure that officers will execute orders despite appropriate moral struggle, because they understand the necessity of maintaining the deterrent. Lieutenant Walters' honesty suggests she is exactly the kind of thoughtful, responsible officer we want in this position. The recommendation was accepted. Walters and Drake continued their service, carrying with them the knowledge of how close they had come to participating in the end of the world. In Colorado Springs, the Mitchell family was attempting to rebuild their lives. James Mitchell's retirement had become official on December 31st, 1983. At the ceremony, attended by family and a few close colleagues, General Hastings had spoken of Mitchell's decades of distinguished service, making only oblique reference to the incident that had ended his career. Colonel Mitchell served his country with honor and dedication through multiple conflicts and challenges, Hastings had said. He bore responsibilities that few can imagine, and he carried them with professionalism and integrity. We thank him for his service and wish him well in retirement. The words were kind, but Mitchell heard what they didn't say. No mention of the briefcase. No acknowledgement of the crisis. Just the polite fiction that this was a normal retirement after a normal career. Margaret Mitchell, watching her husband accept his retirement certificate, felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at the Air Force for ending his career over a single mistake. Relief that the investigation had found no evidence of espionage or deliberate wrongdoing. Fear about their future, about how Jim would cope with forced retirement at 52. And underneath it all, a persistent question. Had she contributed to this by making him feel guilty about being away during Sarah's accident? She would never ask him that question. Some burdens were too heavy to share, some guilt too corrosive to articulate. They would move forward, find new routines, build a post-military life. But the shadow of that November morning would always be there, a ghost haunting their marriage. For Sarah Mitchell, recovering from her car accident and watching her father's career implode, the aftermath brought its own form of guilt. If she hadn't crashed her car, if her father hadn't been distracted by worry about her, would he have picked up the right briefcase? The logic was clear and devastating. Her accident had been the first domino in a chain that nearly ended human civilization. It's not your fault, her father told her repeatedly. I made the choice to go on the career run while dealing with a family crisis. That was my decision, my responsibility. But Sarah couldn't fully accept this absolution. She was young enough to think in terms of simple cause and effect, old enough to understand the magnitude of what had almost happened. The weight of that knowledge would shape her life in ways she couldn't yet predict. In the Soviet Union, the aftermath of the crisis had different but equally profound impacts. Captain Alexander Moiseev, the submarine commander who had prepared his boat for possible nuclear launch operations, returned to port after an extended patrol that had kept him at sea through the most dangerous phase of the crisis. His orders upon return were unusual. Report immediately to Naval Intelligence for debriefing. The debriefing lasted 3 days, covering every aspect of his patrol, his communications with fleet headquarters, his crew's readiness for combat operations. What Naval Intelligence wanted to understand was how close Moiseev had come to actually launching his missiles. The answer was uncomfortable, closer than anyone in the Soviet command structure had realized. During the peak of the crisis, Moiseev had received a garbled communication that he had initially interpreted as a launch order. Only by demanding clarification and authentication, a process that took several agonizing minutes, had he determined that the communication was actually a routine status check corrupted by atmospheric interference. If you had interpreted that message as a launch order, would you have executed it? The intelligence officer asked. After proper authentication protocols, yes, Moiseev replied. That is my duty, and if authentication had not been possible, if you had lost communication with headquarters and had only the partial message. Moiseev was silent for a long moment. I hope I would have had the courage to wait, to seek clarification rather than acting on incomplete information. But I cannot be certain. In the moment, with the belief that war had begun, I might have launched. This admission led to a comprehensive review of Soviet naval nuclear launch procedures, resulting in enhanced authentication requirements and additional safeguards against accidental or unauthorized launch. Moiseev's honesty had likely prevented future incidents, but it also ended his prospects for promotion. The Soviet Navy wanted officers who would follow orders without question, not officers who admitted to doubts. As 1984 began, the various participants in the crisis moved on with their lives, carrying the weight of their experiences in different ways. But the broader implications of what had happened continued to ripple through the national security establishments of both superpowers. In classified studies and confidential memos, analysts on both sides reached similar conclusions. The nuclear balance was far more unstable than official doctrine acknowledged. The margin for error was razor thin. A single mistake, a moment of misunderstanding, a coincidence of timing. Any of these could trigger escalation spirals that led to catastrophe. These realizations contributed to a gradual shift in Cold War dynamics. Not immediately, and not obviously to outside observers, but in subtle ways that would eventually matter. A greater willingness to communicate during crises, more sophisticated understanding of how the other side thought and interpreted events, enhanced emphasis on verification and confidence-building measures. The briefcase incident, known to almost no one, had taught a lesson that would help prevent future crises from spiraling out of control. But it had also revealed a terrifying truth. Humanity's survival in the nuclear age depended on a combination of technology, training, judgment, and sheer luck. And luck, by definition, was not something you could rely on indefinitely. 20 years later, after the Cold War had ended and many of the participants in the crisis had retired or passed away, portions of the incident would be declassified and made available to historians. The full story would still remain classified, but enough details would emerge to provide a case study in crisis management and nuclear near misses. Scholars studying the incident would debate its significance. Some would argue it demonstrated the robustness of nuclear command and control systems. After all, despite multiple opportunities for catastrophic failure, the crisis had been managed successfully. Others would argue it proved the opposite, that humanity had survived only through luck and last-minute good judgment, and that similar incidents in the future might have different outcomes. Both interpretations had merit. The crisis had been managed, but it had also been desperately close to disaster. The systems had worked, but they had been strained to their limits. The humans involved had made mostly good decisions, but they had also made crucial errors. What was indisputable was that on November 15th to 16th, 1983, the world had come closer to nuclear war than most people would ever know. A tired Air Force colonel, picking up the wrong briefcase in a Denver airport, had set in motion a chain of events that brought civilization to the brink of annihilation. The fact that disaster had been averted was cause for relief, but not for complacency. The briefcase incident had revealed the fragility of nuclear peace, the ease with which misunderstanding could escalate to catastrophe, and the terrifying reality that humanity's survival depended on systems and people functioning perfectly under conditions of extreme stress and imperfect information. As Colonel James Mitchell would reflect in his private writings years later, I made a simple mistake that could have ended the world. That knowledge has to mean something. It has to drive us to build better systems, to communicate more effectively, to find ways to step back from the nuclear precipice. Because next time, we might not be so lucky. Next time, the briefcase might not be recovered. Next time, the escalation might not stop. And there won't be anyone left to study the lessons, because there won't be anyone left at all. It was a sobering thought, one that would haunt everyone who knew the full story of those terrifying 36 hours in November 1983. In the spring of 1987, nearly 4 years after the briefcase incident, a remarkable coincidence occurred that would shed new light on the crisis and reveal connections that had been invisible at the time. Dr. Eleanor Marsh, the CIA analyst who had led the intelligence assessment during the crisis, was attending an academic conference on Cold War history at Georgetown University. The conference had been organized to discuss the recent thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations, the progress of arms control negotiations, and the cautious optimism that the Cold War might be ending rather than escalating. During a coffee break, Marsh found herself in conversation with a visiting scholar from Moscow State University, Professor Dmitry Volkov. The name seemed familiar, but it took her a moment to place it. Volkov had been the KGB colonel who had written the initial assessment of the unusual American military activity on November 15, 1983. Professor Volkov, Marsh said carefully, aware that she was treading on sensitive ground, I believe we may have been working on opposite sides of a particular incident several years ago. Volkov studied her for a moment, his experienced intelligence officer's mind quickly placing her role. The briefcase, he said simply. November 1983. They moved to a quiet corner of the conference hall, both aware that this conversation was extraordinary. Even with glasnost and perestroika creating new openness in Soviet-American relations, direct discussions between intelligence professionals about specific operational incidents were virtually unprecedented. I can tell you now, Volkov said, that we came very close to something terrible that day. Our leadership was genuinely convinced that your country was preparing for war. The coincidence of the Able Archer exercise, the briefcase incident, the surge in your military communications, it all fit the pattern we've been trained to recognize. Operation Ryan, Marsh said, and Volkov nodded in confirmation. We spent so much effort building an intelligence system to warn us of American attack, Volkov continued. But the system itself became a source of danger. It was designed to see patterns, to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent threat picture. And so, when your country responded to a genuine security incident, our system interpreted that response as confirmation of hostile intent. Marsh shared her own perspective. The American confusion about Soviet escalation, the fear that the briefcase had been compromised, the difficult decisions about how to respond without triggering further escalation. What we didn't understand, Marsh said, was how frightened you actually were. We thought you were testing us, probing for weakness, using the crisis for strategic advantage. The possibility that you were genuinely afraid of American attack. That was considered, but it seemed almost absurd. Why would you fear us when we had no intention of attacking? And that, Volkov replied, is the fundamental problem of nuclear deterrence built on mutual suspicion. Intention is invisible. Capability is obvious. When you can only see capability and must infer intention, you will inevitably assume the worst, especially when institutional paranoia and ideological hostility prime you to do so. Their conversation continued for over an hour. Two former intelligence professionals now able to discuss openly what had been deeply classified secrets. What emerged was a picture of the crisis far more nuanced than either side had understood at the time. Volkov revealed details that American intelligence had never learned. There had been a faction within the Soviet Politburo that had actually advocated for preemptive strikes against American nuclear forces during the crisis. The argument had been simple and terrifying. If the Americans were preparing to attack, the only way to survive was to strike first and destroy as much of the American nuclear arsenal as possible before it could be launched. Marshal Ogarkov made the case very forcefully, Volkov recalled. He presented analysis showing that if the Americans were truly preparing for war, waiting would only ensure Soviet destruction. Better to strike now, while surprise was possible, than to wait and be destroyed without the possibility of response. How close did that argument come to being accepted? Marsh asked, her professional composure barely masking her shock. Closer than I would like to admit. Andropov was sick, in pain, increasingly paranoid. If the crisis had lasted another day, if he had made one more threatening move, I think the preemptive strike faction might have prevailed. Marsh shared her own revelation. American contingency plans had included a limited nuclear strike option if intelligence confirmed that Soviet forces were preparing for imminent attack. The plan, codenamed Full Stop, would have targeted Soviet command and control facilities in an attempt to decapitate Soviet leadership before they could order a full-scale launch. It was madness, Volkov said quietly. Both sides preparing to strike first to prevent the other from striking first. A race to Armageddon driven entirely by fear. Their conversation revealed another crucial detail that neither side had fully understood during the crisis. The role of individual decision-makers in preventing escalation. On the American side, President Reagan's personal letters to Andropov and his willingness to implement unilateral de-escalatory measures had been critical. On the Soviet side, Foreign Minister Gromyko's advocacy for caution and Andropov's eventual decision to test American sincerity rather than assume the worst had been equally important. Without those individuals in those positions at that moment, Marsh observed the crisis might have had a very different outcome. Which is terrifying, Volkov replied. because it means we trusted the survival of civilization to the judgment of a few individuals under extreme stress and with imperfect information. Their conversation was interrupted by the conference resuming, but they agreed to continue their dialogue. Over the following months, working through academic channels and with the blessing of their respective governments, both of which were now interested in understanding past crises to avoid future ones, Marsh and Volkov collaborated on a classified study of the briefcase incident. The study revealed connections and near misses that had been invisible to either side during the crisis. They discovered that on November 15, 1983, a Soviet satellite had experienced a temporary malfunction that had briefly shown what appeared to be American missile launches. The malfunction had been quickly identified and disregarded, but for 15 minutes, Soviet early warning operators had believed they were seeing the beginning of an American attack. This incident, occurring simultaneously with the heightened tensions from the briefcase crisis, had nearly triggered Soviet launch procedures. Only the standing order requiring human confirmation of satellite warnings, a policy implemented after the false alarm incident earlier that same year involving Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov, had prevented automatic escalation. So, we had multiple near catastrophes happening simultaneously, Marsh realized. The briefcase incident, the satellite malfunction, the Able Archer exercise, Soviet paranoia about Ryan. Any one of these might have been manageable in isolation. But together, they created a perfect storm of miscommunication and escalation. The study also revealed the role that individual courage had played in preventing disaster. Beyond Petrov's famous decision not to report the September satellite false alarm, there had been numerous other instances where individuals had chosen caution over haste, clarification over assumption, humanity over procedure. The Soviet submarine commander Moiseev, insisting on authentication before launching even when he believed war might have begun. The American launch officers Walters and Drake, maintaining their vigilance despite moral uncertainty. The air traffic controllers and security personnel who had remained calm during the crisis. Even Martha Henshaw, the lost and found supervisor, whose careful logging and storage of the briefcase had ensured it remained secure and recoverable. We survived, Volkov concluded in the study's final section, not because our systems were perfect, but because our systems were populated by imperfect humans who nonetheless rose to the occasion when it mattered most. This is both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it demonstrates human capacity for wisdom under pressure. Terrifying because it suggests we have been relying on individual heroism to prevent systemic catastrophe. The study was classified at the highest levels and shared only with senior officials in both governments. But its conclusions influenced the ongoing arms control negotiations, adding urgency to efforts to reduce nuclear arsenals and improve crisis communication systems. In 1988, at a summit in Moscow, Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev would sign the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons for the first time in history. At the signing ceremony, Reagan would tell Gorbachev privately about the briefcase incident, the full details of which Gorbachev had not previously known, despite being Soviet leader. Gorbachev's reaction was visceral shock. You mean we came that close to war over a briefcase? Over a mistake. That close, Reagan confirmed. Maybe closer. Then we must ensure, Gorbachev said firmly, that we eliminate these weapons entirely. Because eventually, our luck will run out. That conversation would prove influential in shaping the even more ambitious arms reduction discussions that would follow in subsequent years. Meanwhile, the individual participants in the crisis continued their lives, most never knowing how their actions had contributed to averting disaster. Colonel Mitchell, retired and working as a security consultant in Colorado, would sometimes see news reports about arms control progress and wonder if the incident that had ended his career had contributed in some small way to these positive developments. He would never know the full story, never learn about Volkov's revelations or the multiple near catastrophes that had accompanied his mistake. Martha Henshaw, still working at Denver's airport, now at the new Stapleton International Airport terminal, would occasionally tell friends about the time federal agents had descended on her lost and found office over a briefcase. It was a good story, a mystery she had been part of, though she could never explain what had made that particular briefcase so important. Robert Thornton, the pharmaceutical salesman, had long since forgotten the day his briefcase had been involved in something strange. It was just another travel story, another odd experience in a career of business trips and hotel rooms. None of them knew they had been part of a moment when history balanced on a knife's edge, when the future of human civilization hung on a series of small decisions and coincidences and individual acts of courage or caution. This was perhaps the most haunting aspect of the briefcase incident. How close the world had come to destruction while going about its ordinary business, unaware of the precipice it stood upon. In his private papers, discovered after his death in 2004, President Reagan had written an extended reflection on the incident. The briefcase crisis taught me something I wish I had understood earlier in my presidency. Nuclear weapons are not simply tools of statecraft or instruments of deterrence. They are loaded guns pointed at civilization itself, and we have been trusting that no one's hand will shake, no one will misinterpret a signal, no accident will pull the trigger. That's not strategy. That's Russian roulette with the fate of humanity. I'm proud that we were able to de-escalate that crisis, proud that cooler heads prevailed. But I'm haunted by how easily it could have gone differently. One more coincidence, one more misunderstanding, one leader less willing to take the risk of appearing weak by stepping back. Any of these could have ended everything. This is why I became convinced that we needed not just arms control, but arms elimination. Because you cannot have perfect safety with these weapons. The briefcase showed me that. We were lucky in November 1983. But relying on luck is not a strategy. It's a prayer. And prayers are not enough when the stakes are the end of the world. The briefcase incident remained mostly classified, its lessons absorbed by those who needed to know, but hidden from public view. But the connections revealed by Marsh and Volkov's collaboration, the near misses discovered in retrospective analysis, and the personal accounts of those involved all pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. The nuclear peace of the Cold War had been far more fragile than anyone publicly acknowledged, sustained more by luck and individual wisdom than by the robust systems and rational deterrence that official doctrine claimed. As the Cold War ended and the nuclear arsenals began their slow reduction, the briefcase incident remained a reminder of how close humanity had come to destroying itself not through malice or aggression, but through the compounding effects of human error, institutional paranoia, and the terrible logic of weapons that made no distinction between accident and intention in their destructive power. The hidden connections between American security responses and Soviet fears, between individual decisions and systemic outcomes, between technical accidents and political crises, all illustrated a fundamental truth that the crisis had made clear. In the nuclear age, everything was connected. Every action had potential for catastrophic misinterpretation, and the margin for error was far smaller than the margin for disaster. It was a lesson that would remain relevant long after the Cold War ended, a reminder for future generations of the dangers of weapons that made human fallibility potentially fatal to human civilization itself. Part 10, Legacy and Lessons. The year 2008 marked the 25th anniversary of the briefcase incident, and a small group of historians, former officials, and survivors gathered at a closed conference to discuss the crisis and its implications. The conference was held under the auspices of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, an organization that had spent decades declassifying Cold War documents and making them available for historical analysis. Many of those who had played crucial roles in the crisis were gone. President Reagan had died in 2004, still bearing the burden of nuclear knowledge and the memory of how close his administration had come to presiding over Armageddon. Yuri Andropov had died in 1984, just months after the crisis, his health destroyed by kidney disease and the stress of leading a superpower he believed was under existential threat. General Ogarkov had passed away in 1994, Marshal Ustinov in 1984. But others remained. Eleanor Marsh, now retired from the CIA and teaching at Johns Hopkins. Dmitry Volkov, who had defected to the West in 1991 and was now a prominent scholar of intelligence history. Patricia Walters, the former missile launch officer, now a senior official in the Department of Energy, and James Mitchell, 77 years old, making his first public appearance related to the incident that had defined and ended his military career. The conference began with a screening of recently declassified footage from the crisis. Grainy video from the Situation Room, Soviet military communications intercepts, now translated and annotated, and the timeline of events as they had unfolded over those terrifying 36 hours in November 1983. Watching the footage, Mitchell felt the weight of those years fall away. He was back in Stapleton Airport, exhausted and worried about his daughter, reaching for a briefcase that looked identical to his own. The shame was still there, but tempered now by time and by the knowledge that he had not been alone in making mistakes during that crisis. When it came time for him to speak, Mitchell chose his words carefully. For 25 years, I have carried the weight of what I did. I made a mistake that could have ended human civilization. That's not hyperbole. That's simple fact. And I've had to live with that knowledge every day since. But what I've learned, what these documents and testimonies show, is that I was just one point of failure in a system that had many potential points of failure. Yes, I picked up the wrong briefcase. But the crisis that followed was shaped by institutional paranoia, by communication failures, by coincidental technical malfunctions, by the dangerous logic of nuclear deterrence itself. I don't say this to absolve myself of responsibility. I made a mistake, and I paid the price for it. But I do say it to make a larger point. We built a global security system that depended on perfection, perfect vigilance, perfect communication, perfect interpretation of intentions. And then we populated that system with humans, who are by definition imperfect. That was the real mistake. Not my error in picking up the wrong briefcase, but our collective error in building a system that couldn't tolerate human mistakes without risking human extinction. His words were met with silence, then sustained applause. Mitchell had articulated what many in the room understood but found difficult to express. The briefcase incident had revealed not just individual failures, but systemic fragility. Eleanor Marsh spoke next, presenting the findings from her collaboration with Volkov and from subsequent research into the crisis. What we've learned from studying this incident is that Cold War nuclear deterrence was far more unstable than we acknowledged at the time. We had constructed an elaborate theoretical framework: mutual assured destruction, second strike capability, crisis stability, and we convinced ourselves that this framework was robust and manageable. But the briefcase crisis exposed the reality beneath the theory. The reality was that a single mistake could trigger escalation spirals that brought us to the brink of war. The reality was that even when both sides wanted to avoid conflict, the interaction of their defensive measures could create dangerous momentum toward catastrophe. The reality was that we were trusting human civilization to the hope that nothing would go seriously wrong. And in November 1983, something did go seriously wrong. Multiple things, actually. And we survived only because a series of individuals, Reagan, Andropov, various military officers, even a lost and found supervisor, made wise decisions under pressure. We survived because we were lucky. She paused to let this sink in. Luck is not a strategy. It's not something you can rely on. And yet, for decades, the survival of human civilization depended substantially on luck. Luck that mistakes would be caught in time. Luck that misunderstandings would be clarified before it was too late. Luck that the humans operating our nuclear systems would rise to the occasion when it mattered most. But beyond these technical and policy recommendations, the conference participants recognized a deeper lesson. The briefcase crisis had revealed the fundamental incompatibility between nuclear weapons and human fallibility. As long as these weapons existed, as long as humans controlled them, the potential for catastrophic error would persist. We got lucky in 1983. Eleanor Marsh summarized in the conference's final session. We've gotten lucky many other times too. Petrov in September 1983, the Norwegian weather rocket incident in 1995, the Y2K scare, and probably other near misses we still don't know about. But luck is finite. Eventually, if we maintain systems that require perfection from imperfect beings, that require flawless communication between parties prone to misunderstanding, that require wise decisions under conditions of extreme stress and limited information. Eventually, we will run out of luck. In the years that followed the conference, the lessons of the briefcase incident would influence a new generation of arms control advocates, nuclear security experts, and peace activists. The story, once fully declassified, became a powerful illustration of nuclear danger not from malice or aggression, but from the simple, inevitable reality of human imperfection. James Mitchell lived to see this legacy unfold. He passed away in 2015 at the age of 84, having spent his retirement years not in shame, but in advocacy for nuclear disarmament and improved safety systems. His final public statement, given at a nuclear security conference 6 months before his death, captured the wisdom he had gained from his mistake. I made an error that could have ended the world. I have spent 32 #how a lost briefcase at a Denver airport almost started World War III.